The story of the Teutonic peoples begins not with the clash of iron weapons or the thunder of migrating hordes, but in the quiet accumulation of cultural innovations across the windswept landscapes of Bronze Age Scandinavia and northern Germany. Between 1700 and 500 BC, archaeological evidence reveals the gradual crystallization of what scholars recognize as distinctly Germanic cultural patterns, emerging from the broader Indo-European substrate that had spread across northern Europe in preceding millennia. The Nordic Bronze Age left behind a remarkable archaeological record that illuminates the foundations of Germanic civilization. Excavations across Denmark, southern Sweden, and the North German plain have uncovered elaborate burial sites that demonstrate sophisticated metalworking techniques and complex social hierarchies. The Trundholm sun chariot, discovered in a Danish bog and dating to approximately 1400 BC, exemplifies the technical mastery and religious symbolism that characterized this period. This bronze artifact, featuring a horse pulling a golden solar disk, reveals not only advanced metallurgical skills, but also the central role of solar worship that would persist throughout Germanic religious traditions. Burial practices from this era provide crucial insights into emerging Germanic cultural identity. The transition from collective megalithic tombs to individual barrow burials marks a fundamental shift in social organization. These individual graves, particularly those of the elite, contained distinctive assemblages of bronze weapons, ornaments, and ceremonial objects that would become hallmarks of Germanic material culture. The Bormeskjolds burial mounds in Denmark, dating to 1351 to 1345 BC, contained remarkably preserved organic materials including woolen garments, leather shoes, and wooden artifacts that demonstrate the sophisticated textile production and craftsmanship of these early Germanic communities. The metalwork from this period displays characteristic techniques and decorative motifs that distinguish Germanic production from contemporary Celtic and other European traditions. Bronze swords from the Scandinavian peninsula featured distinctive hilts with organic materials like horn and wood, often decorated with intricate geometric patterns. The development of the Nordic bronze sword tradition, with its emphasis on practical functionality combined with symbolic ornamentation, established patterns that would influence Germanic weapon design for centuries. Archaeological analysis of bronze composition reveals extensive trade networks reaching as far as the Alpine regions for tin and the British Isles for copper, indicating that these early Germanic societies were far from isolated. Pottery traditions provide another crucial marker of Germanic cultural development. The distinctive cord-marked ceramics that appear across northern Europe during this period show regional variations that correspond to emerging tribal territories. The Lusatian culture pottery from the Oder and Vistula river basins displays characteristic forms and decorative techniques that would influence Germanic ceramic traditions well into the Iron Age. These vessels, often featuring geometric patterns created by cord impressions or incised designs, served both practical and ceremonial functions within Germanic households and religious contexts. The linguistic development of Proto-Germanic during this period represents one of the most significant cultural achievements of these early communities. Emerging from the broader Indo-European language family, Proto-Germanic underwent distinctive sound changes and grammatical innovations that set it apart from its Celtic, Italic, and Slavic relatives. The first Germanic sound shift, known to linguists as Grimm's Law, fundamentally altered the consonant system inherited from Proto-Indo-European, creating the phonological foundation for all later Germanic languages. Archaeological evidence suggests that Proto-Germanic developed across a core region encompassing modern Denmark, southern Sweden, northern Germany, and the western Baltic coast. Within this territory, dialectical variations emerged that would eventually give rise to the major Germanic language branches. the North Germanic dialects, ancestral to the later Scandinavian languages, developed in the Scandinavian peninsula and Denmark. The West Germanic dialects, which would produce Old High German, Old Saxon and Anglo-Saxon, emerged in the regions between the Rhine and Elbe rivers. The East Germanic branch, later represented by Gothic, developed among populations that would migrate southward and eastward during the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age. Linguistic reconstruction reveals that Proto-Germanic speakers possessed a sophisticated vocabulary for maritime activities, metalworking and animal husbandry that reflects their material culture. Terms for specific types of ships, sailing techniques, and coastal navigation demonstrate the maritime orientation of these communities. The Germanic root skipam and a related nautical terminology indicate that seafaring was integral to Germanic identity from its earliest stages. Similarly, the elaborate vocabulary for different types of weapons, armour and combat techniques reflects the warrior culture that archaeological evidence confirms through burial assemblages. Religious practices among these early Germanic communities centred on the veneration of natural forces and ancestral spirits, establishing patterns that would evolve into the complex mythological systems known from later sources. Archaeological evidence from ritual deposits in bogs, springs and other natural features reveals the central importance of water in Germanic religious practice. The Hjortspring boat, discovered in a Danish bog and dating to approximately 350 BC, represents a votive offering that demonstrates the connection between maritime technology and religious devotion. Solar symbolism appears consistently across Germanic archaeological sites from this period. Bronze razors decorated with solar motifs, rock carvings featuring sun wheels and horse-drawn solar chariots, and the orientation of burial monuments towards solar alignments all point to sophisticated astronomical observations and solar worship. The prevalence of horse imagery in religious contexts, from the Trundholm chariot to countless rock carvings across Scandinavia, suggests that horses held special significance as divine messengers or symbols of celestial movement, in ancestor veneration manifested through elaborate burial rituals and the construction of monumental barrows that remained focal points for community identity across generations. The practice of placing grave goods with the deceased, including weapons, jewellery and food vessels, indicates beliefs about the afterlife that would later develop into concepts of Valhalla and other Germanic otherworld destinations. Some burial sites show evidence of continued ritual activity long after initial interment, suggesting ongoing communication between the living and the dead. The emergence of what scholars recognise as proto-forms of later Norse mythology can be traced through iconographic analysis of Bronze Age rock art and metalwork. The Kivik grave in Sweden, dating to approximately 1000 BC, contains stone carvings that appear to depict mythological scenes, including processions of figures, solar symbols, and what may be early representations of divine or heroic narratives. These images share striking similarities with later Scandinavian mythological art, suggesting continuity in religious traditions across more than a millennium. Distinctive burial practices further differentiated Germanic communities from their Celtic and other European neighbours. While Celtic traditions often emphasised collective burial in chambered tombs or the deposition of metalwork in water features, Germanic practices showed a preference for individual barrow burial with personal grave goods. The orientation of Germanic graves, typically east-west with the deceased facing east toward the rising sun, contrasts with Celtic burial orientations and reflects the solar orientation evident throughout Germanic religious practice. The development of distinctive artistic styles during the Late Bronze Age established aesthetic traditions that would influence Germanic material culture throughout its historical development. The geometric patterns, animal motifs, and symbolic designs that appear on metalwork, pottery, and stone carvings from this period display consistent stylistic elements across the Germanic cultural sphere. These artistic traditions show clear differences from contemporary Celtic Latin styles or Mediterranean classical influences, indicating the emergence of a distinctly Germanic aesthetic sensibility. Trade relationships during this period reveal the extent of Germanic cultural influence and the networks that connected Northern European communities. Amber from the Baltic coast reached the Mediterranean through Germanic intermediaries, while bronze and other materials flowed northward along established trade routes. These commercial relationships facilitated cultural exchange, while also reinforcing Germanic identity through the selective adoption and adaptation of foreign influences. The transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age around 500 BC marked a crucial turning point in Germanic development. The adoption of iron technology, initially through contact with Celtic smiths, provided Germanic communities with superior weapons and tools while maintaining their distinctive cultural practices and social organisation. This technological advancement would prove crucial as Germanic peoples began the migrations and expansions that would bring them into direct contact with the Roman world and ultimately reshape the political landscape of Europe. The mastery of iron technology that had transformed Germanic society during the 6th and 5th centuries BC provided the foundation for unprecedented military capabilities and population growth that would soon challenge the established order of the ancient world. As Germanic communities across the northern European plain experienced demographic pressures and environmental changes, the stage was set for the first major confrontation between the tribal confederations of the north and the expanding Roman Republic. The late 2nd century BC witnessed a series of harsh winters and crop failures across Jutland and the Danish archipelago that archaeological evidence suggests may have been linked to broader climatic deterioration. Pollen analysis from bog cores in northern Germany and Denmark reveals a marked decline in agricultural indicators during this period, while tree ring data from Scandinavian forests shows evidence of prolonged cold periods that would have severely impacted Germanic agricultural communities dependent on barley and rye cultivation. These environmental pressures, combined with population growth facilitated by improved iron tools and weapons, created conditions that made large-scale migration not merely attractive but necessary for survival. The Cimbri emerged from this crisis as the dominant force among the migrating Germanic peoples. Their homeland in northern Jutland, the peninsula that Romans would later call the Cimbric Chersonese, had supported a sophisticated Iron Age culture for centuries. Archaeological excavations at sites like Debjerg have revealed the material wealth of Cimbric society, including ornate ceremonial wagons with bronze fittings and elaborate religious deposits that demonstrate both technological sophistication and extensive trade connections. The Cimbri possessed advanced iron working techniques that produced weapons superior to those of many Mediterranean peoples, including pattern-welded sword blades that combined different grades of iron and steel to create both flexibility and cutting power. Joining the Cimbri in their southward migration were the Teutons, whose name would eventually provide the linguistic root for the term Teutonic that later Romans applied to all Germanic peoples. The Teutons originated from the coastal regions of what is now Schleswig-Holstein and the southern portions of the Jutland Peninsula, where they had developed a maritime culture that combined agricultural settlement with extensive sea-based trade and raiding. Their settlements along the North Sea coast featured sophisticated harbour installations and evidence of shipbuilding activities that produced vessels capable of both coastal navigation and river transport. The tribal organisation of the Teutoners reflected their dual maritime and agricultural economy. Unlike the more hierarchical structure that characterised some Germanic societies, the Teutons maintained a system based on extended kinship groups that could rapidly mobilise for military campaigns while maintaining flexible leadership structures. Their kings, including the historically attested Lugotorix, derived authority not from inherited divine status, but from demonstrated military success, and the ability to distribute wealth among their followers. This system proved particularly effective during the migration period, as it allowed for rapid decision-making and adaptation to changing circumstances. The alliance between the Cimbri and Teutons represented more than a mere military convenience. Both peoples shared similar religious practices centered on the worship of war deities and the veneration of sacred groves and springs. Roman sources describe elaborate ritual practices involving human sacrifice and divination that the Germanic warriors employed before major battles. The priestesses who accompanied the migrating tribes, whom Romans called prophetesses, played crucial roles in maintaining tribal cohesion and providing religious sanction for military decisions. These women, often described as elderly and possessing supernatural powers, conducted sacrificial rites using prisoners of war and interpreted omens from the examination of entrails and the observation of natural phenomena. The military organisation of the Germanic war bands that invaded Roman territory represented a sophisticated adaptation of traditional tribal structures to the demands of large-scale warfare. The basic unit remained the comitatus, a band of warriors bound to a particular leader through personal oaths of loyalty and expectations of shared plunder. However, the scale of the Cimbrian migration required coordination among multiple comitatus groups under the overall authority of war kings like Boiorix of the Cimbri and Lugotorix of the Teutons. Germanic warriors of this period fought with a distinctive combination of weapons that reflected both their Iron Age technology and their cultural values. The primary weapon was the framea, a long spear with a narrow iron point that could be used both for thrusting in close combat and as a missile weapon. Archaeological finds from Germanic settlements of this period reveal framea with points measuring up to 50 centimetres in length, designed to penetrate both armour and shields. Warriors also carried broad-bladed swords, often pattern-welded and decorated with runic inscriptions or geometric patterns that held religious significance. Defensive equipment varied according to the warrior's status and wealth. Elite fighters possessed iron helmets, often decorated with bronze fittings and featuring protective cheek pieces that provided excellent protection while maintaining visibility. The most distinctive feature of Germanic defensive equipment was the shield, typically constructed of wooden planks bound with iron and featuring a central iron boss that could be used offensively to strike opponents. These shields measured approximately 1 metre in diameter and were painted with tribal symbols and personal devices that allowed for identification during the chaos of battle. The Germanic battle formation that so impressed and terrified Roman observers was the wedge or boar's head formation, known in their language as the Svinfylking. This tactical arrangement placed the most experienced warriors at the point of the wedge, with younger fighters arranged in successive rows behind them. The formation's effectiveness lay in its ability to concentrate force at a single point while maintaining flexibility for rapid maneuvers. Roman military writers noted that Germanic warriors could rapidly reform their wedge formations even after initial contact with enemy forces, a tactical sophistication that contradicted Roman assumptions about barbarian fighting methods. The first major encounter between the migrating Germanic peoples and Roman forces occurred in 113 BC, when the consul Gnaeus Papirius Carbo intercepted the Cimbri and their allies near Nhrea in the eastern Alps. The Germanic Confederation had been moving southward through the Danube Valley, following established trade routes that had connected the northern European plain with the Mediterranean world for centuries. Their intention appears to have been peaceful passage rather than conquest, as they had sent envoys to Roman authorities requesting permission to settle in uninhabited lands. Carbo's decision to attack the Germanic migrants, despite their diplomatic overtures, reflected Roman attitudes toward barbarian peoples that would characterize subsequent encounters. The consul positioned his legions in what he believed was an advantageous position, utilizing the mountainous terrain to limit Germanic mobility while maximizing the effectiveness of Roman heavy infantry tactics. However, the Battle of Nerea demonstrated the limitations of traditional Roman military doctrine when confronted with Germanic tactical innovations. The Germanic warriors employed a combination of feigned retreats and coordinated flanking maneuvers that disrupted Roman formations and created opportunities for their superior individual fighting skills to determine the outcome. The Framia proved particularly effective against Roman scuta, as the long iron points could penetrate the layered wood and leather construction of Roman shields, while the weapon's length allowed Germanic warriors to engage Roman legionaries before the latter could bring their gladi to bear effectively. The disaster at Nerea sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world and marked the beginning of what historians term the Cimbrian War. The complete destruction of Carbo's army demonstrated that the Germanic peoples represented a military threat unlike any that Rome had previously encountered. Unlike Gallic or other Celtic opponents, who typically relied on individual heroics and undisciplined charges, the Germanic confederations displayed tactical coordination and strategic planning that rivaled Roman military capabilities. Following their victory at Nerea, the Cimbrian Teutons continued their migration westward, moving through the Alpine passes into Gaul. Their route took them through territories controlled by various Celtic tribes, many of whom either joined the migration or were displaced by the advancing Germanic peoples. This movement created a domino effect of population displacement that affected much of Central and Western Europe, as established communities were forced to relocate or defend their territories against the newcomers. The Germanic migration differed fundamentally from typical military campaigns of the ancient world. Entire populations moved together, including women, children, elderly individuals, and all their portable possessions loaded onto ox-drawn wagons that stretched for miles along the migration routes. Roman observers estimated that the total number of people involved in the movement exceeded 300,000 individuals, making it one of the largest population movements in recorded ancient history. The logistical challenges of maintaining such a massive migration required sophisticated organizational systems that belied Roman stereotypes about barbarian chaos and disorder. The Germanic peoples established regular camping procedures that could accommodate their entire population, while providing defensive positions against potential attacks. These temporary settlements featured concentric defensive arrangements, with the wagons forming outer barriers while warriors established perimeter guards and scouts maintained contact with surrounding territories. Foraging and supply procurement followed established patterns that minimized conflicts with local populations, while ensuring adequate provisions for the migrating peoples. Germanic leaders negotiated with Celtic and other tribal groups for the purchase of grain and livestock, often paying with amber, furs, and metalwork produced by skilled artisans who traveled with the migration. These commercial relationships demonstrated that the Germanic peoples possessed sophisticated diplomatic and economic capabilities alongside their military prowess. The continued southward movement of the Cimbrian Teutons brought them into conflict with additional Roman forces as the Republic struggled to contain what it perceived as an existential threat to Italian security. In 109 BC, the consul Marcus Junius Silanus attempted to intercept the Germanic migration in southern Gaul, near the Rhone River Valley. The ensuing battle resulted in another catastrophic Roman defeat, with Silanus losing most of his army and barely escaping with his life. The tactical innovations displayed by Germanic forces during this engagement further demonstrated their military sophistication. The Teutons, fighting alongside their Cimbric allies, employed coordinated cavalry and infantry attacks that exploited weaknesses in Roman defensive formations. Germanic horsemen, mounted on sturdy northern European horses bred for endurance rather than speed, conducted harassment attacks that disrupted Roman communications and supply lines, while the main infantry force engaged in direct combat. The psychological impact of repeated Germanic victories over Roman legions cannot be overstated. Roman military prestige, built upon centuries of successful conquest throughout the Mediterranean world, suffered severe damage as news of these defeats spread throughout the Republic. The Germanic peoples had demonstrated that Roman military superiority was not absolute, and that barbarian peoples could defeat the legions through superior tactics and individual martial skill. These early encounters established patterns of Germanic-Roman interaction that would persist for centuries. The Germanic emphasis on personal combat prowess, flexible tactical formations, and the integration of entire populations into military campaigns challenged fundamental Roman assumptions about warfare and civilization. The Cimbrian War represented not merely a military conflict, but a clash between fundamentally different approaches to social organization, military culture, and territorial expansion that would shape the subsequent development of European history. The military encounters between Germanic peoples and Roman forces during the Cimbrian War had provided Romans with their first direct experience of Teutonic warfare, but systematic understanding of Germanic society remained fragmentary and often distorted by military propaganda. It was not until Publius Cornelius Tacitus composed his ethnographic masterwork Germania in 98 AD that the Roman world received a comprehensive analysis of Germanic tribal structure, customs, and territories based on careful observation and reliable sources, rather than battlefield impressions and hearsay. Tacitus approached his subject with the methodical precision of a trained historian and the analytical mindset of a seasoned political observer. Having served as praetor under Emperor Domitian and having access to military reports, diplomatic correspondence, and first-hand accounts from traders and soldiers who had operated beyond the Rhine frontier, Tacitus synthesized diverse sources of information into a coherent portrait of Germanic civilization that would influence European understanding of Teutonic peoples for centuries. His work drew upon earlier ethnographic traditions established by Greek writers like Strabo and Roman military commentators, but surpassed these predecessors in both scope and analytical sophistication. The Germania opens with a geographical description that establishes the territorial extent of Germanic settlement from the Rhine River in the west to the Vistula River in the east, and from the North and Baltic Seas in the north to the Danube River in the south. Tacitus recognized that this vast region contained numerous distinct peoples who shared common linguistic and cultural characteristics while maintaining separate tribal identities and territorial boundaries. He identified major tribal groupings, including the Suebi, who occupied the central regions between the Elbe and Oder rivers, the Cherusci, who controlled territories along the Weser River, the Chatti, who dominated the mountainous regions of central Germany, and the Batavi, who inhabited the Rhine Delta region. Tacitus's analysis of Germanic political organization revealed sophisticated governmental structures that challenged Roman assumptions about barbarian chaos and disorder. Germanic tribes operated under systems that balanced monarchical authority with aristocratic councils and popular assemblies, creating checks and balances that prevented the concentration of absolute power while maintaining effective decision-making capabilities. The institution of kingship among Germanic peoples differed fundamentally from Roman concepts of monarchy, as Germanic kings derived their authority from demonstrated military leadership and the consent of free warriors rather than hereditary divine right or constitutional appointment. Germanic kings, whom Tacitus termed reges, possessed limited powers that focused primarily on military command and the administration of justice in cases involving intertribal disputes or serious crimes against tribal law. During peacetime, kings served more as ceremonial figureheads and arbitrators than as absolute rulers, with real authority residing in the tribal assembly of free warriors known as the Thing. The king's household, supported by tribute and the profits of warfare, maintained a core group of professional warriors who served as both personal bodyguards and the nucleus of tribal military forces during major campaigns. War chiefs, designated as duces by Tacitus, represented a separate category of leadership that operated independently of royal authority during military campaigns. These leaders earned their positions through demonstrated battlefield prowess and the ability to attract followers from among young warriors seeking glory and plunder. Unlike kings, whose authority derived from tribal tradition and formal recognition, war chiefs maintained power only as long as they could provide successful leadership and adequate rewards for their followers. This system created multiple centers of military authority within each tribe and ensured that leadership positions remained accessible to individuals who could prove their capabilities through action rather than birth. The tribal assemblies described by Tacitus functioned as the fundamental democratic institutions of Germanic society, providing forums where free warriors could debate policy decisions, elect leaders, and adjudicate legal disputes. These assemblies, held at regular intervals and during times of crisis, operated according to established procedures that ensured all free men could participate in discussions affecting tribal welfare. Speakers addressed the assembly from elevated positions while warriors indicated their approval or disapproval through the clashing of weapons against shields, creating a distinctive acoustic environment that Roman observers found both impressive and intimidating. Tacitus noted that Germanic assemblies possessed the authority to make binding decisions regarding warfare, territorial disputes, the selection of leaders, and the punishment of serious crimes. The democratic character of these institutions impressed Roman observers who were accustomed to the increasingly autocratic tendencies of imperial government. Germanic warriors could challenge the decisions of kings and war chiefs through formal procedures that protected individual rights while maintaining tribal cohesion and military effectiveness. The social stratification that Tacitus observed among Germanic peoples reflected a complex hierarchy based on birth, wealth, and military achievement that created distinct classes with different rights and obligations. At the apex of Germanic society stood the nobles, termed Edlings in Germanic languages, who possessed hereditary status based on descent from distinguished ancestors, and maintained their position through the ownership of extensive lands, large herds of cattle, and substantial followings of dependent warriors and servants. Germanic nobles distinguished themselves through elaborate material culture that included finely crafted weapons decorated with precious metals, ornate jewellery featuring amber and imported gemstones, and clothing made from expensive fabrics obtained through long-distance trade. The households occupied fortified settlements that served as centres of local administration and provided refuge for surrounding populations during times of conflict. Noble families maintained genealogies that traced their ancestry back to legendary heroes and divine figures, establishing their legitimacy to hold positions of leadership and their right to receive tribute from lesser members of society. The class of free warriors, known as freelings, formed the backbone of Germanic military and political organisation. These individuals possessed personal freedom, the right to bear arms, and the obligation to participate in tribal assemblies and military campaigns. Freelings typically owned small farms worked by their families and a few slaves, maintained their own weapons and equipment, and could aspire to positions of leadership through demonstrated military prowess and the accumulation of wealth through successful warfare or trade. Tacitus emphasized the importance of the warrior ethos that bound Germanic freemen together in relationships of mutual obligation and shared honour. Young men proved their worth through participation in cattle raids, border skirmishes, and major military campaigns that provided opportunities to demonstrate courage, skill, and loyalty to their companions. The Germanic concept of honour, which Tacitus struggled to translate into Latin terminology, encompassed not only individual bravery, but also fidelity to oaths, generosity toward followers, and the maintenance of family reputation across generations. At the bottom of Germanic social hierarchy stood the slaves, called thralls in Germanic languages, who possessed no legal rights and served as the property of their masters. Unlike Roman slavery, which often involved educated individuals who performed administrative and intellectual functions, Germanic slavery typically resulted from military capture, and involved primarily agricultural labour and domestic service. Tacitus noted that Germanic slaves lived in separate households rather than in barrack-style accommodations, maintaining family relationships and sometimes accumulating personal property that could eventually purchase their freedom. The treatment of slaves among Germanic peoples varied considerably depending on their origins and the circumstances of their capture. Prisoners taken in warfare against other Germanic tribes often faced execution or sacrifice to war gods, while captives from Celtic or other non-Germanic peoples might be integrated into tribal society as agricultural workers. Some slaves possessed valuable skills such as metalworking or weaving that made them particularly valuable and could lead to improved treatment and eventual manumission. Germanic religious practices fascinated Tacitus, who provided detailed descriptions of ritual activities that revealed sophisticated theological concepts and elaborate ceremonial traditions. The Germanic pantheon included numerous deities associated with warfare, fertility, wisdom, and natural phenomena, with particular emphasis on gods who embodied the martial values that dominated tribal culture. Tacitus identified Mercury, Mars, and Hercules as the primary Germanic deities, using Roman divine names to describe Germanic gods whose actual identities scholars now recognize as Woden, Tiv, and Donar. Sacred groves served as the primary centres of Germanic religious activity, providing natural temples where tribes conducted their most important ceremonial observances. These woodland sanctuaries, often located near springs or other water features, contained no permanent structures but were marked by carved wooden posts, stone altars, and the skulls of sacrificial animals suspended from tree branches. Tacitus described the atmosphere of these sacred spaces as simultaneously beautiful and terrifying, noting that Germanic peoples approached them with reverence and fear that reflected their understanding of divine power as both protective and dangerous. Human sacrifice played a central role in Germanic religious practice, particularly during times of crisis or before major military campaigns. Tacitus documented various methods of ritual killing that corresponded to different divine requirements and ceremonial purposes. Victims dedicated to Woden were typically hanged from sacred trees, while those offered to Donar were beaten to death with wooden clubs, and sacrifices to Nerthus were drowned in sacred pools or bogs. The selection of sacrificial victims followed established procedures that might involve prisoners of war, criminals condemned for serious offences, or volunteers who sought divine favour through self-sacrifice. The role of women in Germanic society impressed Tacitus, who contrasted Germanic gender relationships with Roman practices that increasingly confined elite women to domestic spheres. Germanic women possessed significant authority within their households, controlled substantial property rights, and participated actively in religious ceremonies as priestesses and prophetesses. Tacitus noted that Germanic warriors believed women possessed supernatural powers of prophecy and divination that made their counsel valuable during times of uncertainty or crisis. Germanic marriage customs reflected the high status accorded to women within tribal society. Marriages typically involved negotiations between families that included substantial bride prices paid by the groom's family to compensate for the loss of the woman's labour and reproductive capacity. Wedding ceremonies included religious rituals that invoked divine protection for the new household and established the spiritual bonds that would unite the couple throughout their lives. Germanic women retained control over their personal property after marriage and could initiate divorce proceedings under certain circumstances that included adultery, abandonment, or physical abuse. The military participation of Germanic women distinguished them from their counterparts in most ancient societies. While women did not typically engage in frontline combat, they accompanied armies during major campaigns, provided medical care for wounded warriors, and sometimes fought desperately when tribal settlements came under attack. Tacitus described instances where Germanic women rallied retreating warriors by exposing their breasts and reminding the men of the fate that awaited their families if they failed to defend their homeland. Germanic women also served as important diplomatic agents who negotiated marriages between tribes, arranged prisoner exchanges, and sometimes mediated territorial disputes. Their roles as keepers of tribal genealogies and oral traditions made them crucial figures in maintaining cultural continuity and legitimizing political arrangements. The respect accorded to elderly women who had demonstrated wisdom and supernatural powers throughout their lives created opportunities for female leadership that impressed Roman observers accustomed to more restrictive gender roles. Tacitus's ethnographic methodology combined direct observation with careful analysis of information provided by reliable informants who had extensive experience in Germanic territories. Roman merchants who traded amber, furs and slaves along the Baltic coast provided detailed accounts of tribal customs and political arrangements in regions beyond direct Roman control. Military officers who had served in Rhine frontier commands contributed intelligence about Germanic military organization and tactical innovations that had proven effective against Roman forces. The accuracy of Tacitus's descriptions can be evaluated through comparison with archaeological evidence from Germanic settlements of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. Excavations at sites like Feddersen-Vierde in Lower Saxony have revealed settlement patterns, architectural techniques, and material culture that correspond closely to Tacitus's written accounts. The discovery of elaborate weapon deposits in Danish bogs, such as those at Illeripedal and Eidsvoll, confirms Tacitus's descriptions of Germanic religious practices involving the sacrifice of military equipment to war gods. The systematic ethnographic observations that Tacitus had recorded during the height of the Pax Romana would prove prophetic as the very tribal structures and military capabilities he described began to exert unprecedented pressure on Roman frontier defences during the 4th and 5th centuries AD. The demographic growth, political consolidation, and military innovations that had characterized Germanic society for centuries reached a critical threshold as climatic changes, internal Roman instability, and the westward movement of Hunnic peoples created conditions that would fundamentally alter the political landscape of Western Europe. Archaeological evidence from Germanic settlements along the Rhine and Danube frontiers reveals significant population increases during the 3rd and 4th centuries, as improved agricultural techniques and the adoption of new crops allowed tribal communities to support larger numbers of people within their traditional territories. Pollen analysis from sites in modern Germany and Poland indicates extensive forest clearance during this period, suggesting that Germanic peoples had reached the carrying capacity of their lands using existing farming methods. Simultaneously, the discovery of substantial weapon hoards and fortified settlements throughout Germanic territories demonstrates that tribal confederations were consolidating military resources and preparing for large-scale conflicts that would require coordinated action among multiple peoples. The pressure building within Germanic territories intensified dramatically, with the westward expansion of Hunnic nomadic confederations from the steppes of Central Asia. The Huns, skilled horsemen armed with powerful composite bows and organised under charismatic war leaders, had established dominance over vast territories stretching from the Volga River to the Carpathian Mountains by the middle of the 4th century. Their military success against Gothic and other East Germanic peoples created a domino effect of displacement that forced established tribal groups to seek new territories or face subjugation under Hunnic rule. The Gothic kingdoms that had flourished north of the Black Sea since the 3rd century found themselves particularly vulnerable to Hunnic expansion. The Visigoths under King Athanaric initially attempted to resist Hunnic pressure through defensive warfare, constructing earthwork fortifications along the Dniester River and organising coalition forces with other Germanic peoples. However, the mobility and tactical superiority of Hunnic cavalry made traditional Germanic defensive strategies ineffective against an enemy that could strike rapidly across vast distances and withdraw before organised retaliation became possible. The collapse of Gothic resistance in 376 AD triggered the first major breach of Roman frontier defences, as desperate Visigothic refugees sought sanctuary within imperial territory. The Gothic leader Fritigern negotiated with Emperor Valens for permission to cross the Danube with his people, offering military service in exchange for land grants and protection from Hunnic pursuit. The Roman government, facing military recruitment difficulties and seeking to exploit Germanic manpower for imperial defence, agreed to these arrangements despite the unprecedented scale of the proposed population transfer. The settlement of Gothic refugees within Roman Thrace quickly deteriorated into open warfare, as imperial administrators failed to provide adequate supplies and attempted to exploit Gothic desperation through extortionate demands for food and basic necessities. Roman officials demanded that Gothic families surrender their children as hostages and pay exorbitant prices for provisions that had been promised as part of the original settlement agreement. These abuses, combined with the natural tensions arising from cultural differences and competition for resources, created conditions that made violent conflict inevitable. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of Germanic military innovations when applied against traditional Roman tactical formations. The Visigothic forces under Fritigern employed a defensive strategy that utilised their wagon train as a fortified base, while Gothic cavalry conducted harassment attacks against Roman formations attempting to approach their position. When Emperor Valens ordered a premature assault against the Gothic defensive perimeter, his legions found themselves trapped between the wagon fortifications and the return of Gothic horsemen who had been conducting reconnaissance operations. The destruction of the Roman army at Adrianople, including the death of Emperor Valens himself, represented more than a tactical defeat. It marked the beginning of a fundamental transformation in the relationship between Germanic peoples and the Roman Empire. The Gothic victory demonstrated that barbarian forces could defeat imperial armies through superior battlefield coordination and tactical innovation, rather than mere numerical superiority or Roman internal weakness. This realization encouraged other Germanic confederations to challenge Roman authority and seek territorial concessions through military pressure rather than diplomatic negotiation. The winter of 405-406 AD brought unprecedented climatic conditions that would catalyse the most significant breach of Roman frontier defences in imperial history. Exceptionally severe cold froze the Rhine River solid for extended periods, creating natural bridges that allowed massive Germanic confederations to cross into Gaul without the logistical challenges typically associated with river crossings. Contemporary sources describe ice formations thick enough to support fully loaded wagons and large cavalry formations, conditions that occurred perhaps once in several generations and provided a unique opportunity for coordinated Germanic action. The confederation that crossed the frozen Rhine included diverse peoples who had been displaced from their traditional territories by Hunnic expansion and internal Germanic conflicts. The Vandals, originally inhabitants of territories along the Oder and Vistula rivers, had been forced westward by pressure from expanding Hunnic influence and conflicts with other Germanic peoples. Their migration brought them into contact with the Suebi, a large tribal confederation that Tacitus had identified as occupying central Germanic territories, and the Alans, Iranian-speaking nomadic peoples who had been displaced from the Pontic steppes by Hunnic expansion. The Vandal confederation that participated in the Rhine crossing represented a sophisticated political alliance that had evolved during decades of migration and conflict. Archaeological evidence from Vandal settlement sites in Silesia and Bohemia reveals a material culture that combined traditional Germanic elements with innovations adopted from contact with Celtic, Sarmatian, and other peoples encountered during their westward movement. Vandal metalwork from this period displays distinctive decorative techniques that incorporated cloisonné inlay work and animal motifs derived from steppe nomadic traditions, indicating extensive cultural exchange and technological adaptation. The military organisation of the Vandal Confederation reflected their experience as a migrating people who had faced numerous conflicts during their movement across Central Europe. Unlike settled Germanic tribes that maintained traditional structures based on kinship groups and territorial divisions, the Vandals had developed flexible command systems that could rapidly integrate warriors from different tribal backgrounds and adapt to changing tactical requirements. Their kings, including the historically significant Gunderic, exercised authority through personal charisma and demonstrated military success rather than hereditary legitimacy alone. The Suebi who joined the Rhine crossing represented fragments of the vast tribal confederation that had once dominated central Germanic territories from the Elbe to the Oder rivers. Pressure from Hunnic expansion and conflicts with other Germanic peoples had fragmented Suebi political unity, creating numerous smaller groups that sought new territories and opportunities for plunder. The Suebi contingents that crossed into Gaul included skilled metalworkers, experienced cavalry fighters, and agricultural specialists who possessed the diverse capabilities necessary for establishing permanent settlements in conquered territories. Suebi military traditions emphasized the use of cavalry forces equipped with long spears and composite bows that reflected their adaptation to warfare against steppe nomadic peoples. Their horsemen rode sturdy Germanic horses bred for endurance rather than speed, allowing them to conduct extended campaigns across difficult terrain while maintaining the mobility necessary for reconnaissance and harassment operations. Suebi infantry forces employed the traditional Germanic combination of spears, swords, and shields, but had adapted their tactical formations to coordinate more effectively with cavalry units during complex battlefield maneuvers. The Alan peoples who participated in the Rhine crossing brought military capabilities and cultural traditions that differed significantly from those of their Germanic allies. As Iranian-speaking nomads from the Pontic steppes, the Alans possessed sophisticated equestrian skills and archery techniques that had been refined through centuries of warfare against other steppe peoples and sedentary populations. Their composite bows, constructed from horn, wood, and sinew, could penetrate armour at distances that exceeded the range of Germanic throwing spears, providing the Confederation with significant tactical advantages in open-field combat. Alan social organisation centred on kinship groups led by war chiefs who maintained authority through their ability to provide successful leadership during military campaigns and adequate grazing territories for their herds during peacetime. Unlike Germanic peoples, who typically combined agricultural and pastoral activities, the Alans remained primarily nomadic and depended on their livestock for both subsistence and wealth accumulation. Their integration into the Germanic Confederation required careful negotiation regarding territorial arrangements and resource allocation that would accommodate their pastoral lifestyle, while maintaining alliance cohesion. The crossing of the Rhine by this massive confederation overwhelmed Roman defensive preparations that had been designed to prevent small-scale raids rather than large-scale invasions. The Rhine frontier fortifications, known as the limes, consisted of watchtowers, small garrison posts, and fortified crossing points that could monitor Germanic activities and respond to limited incursions. However, these installations lacked the manpower and heavy fortifications necessary to resist determined assault by tens of thousands of warriors supported by their entire populations and baggage trains. Roman garrison forces along the Rhine had been reduced by the withdrawal of troops for campaigns in other theatres and the recruitment of Germanic federates who served imperial interests in exchange for land grants and regular payments. The remaining Roman units found themselves vastly outnumbered and unable to coordinate effective resistance against multiple crossing points that were attacked simultaneously by different elements of the Germanic Confederation. Many Roman installations were simply abandoned as their garrisons retreated to more defensible positions, or attempted to join larger imperial forces assembling in the interior of Gaul. The immediate aftermath of the Rhine crossing saw the rapid collapse of Roman civil administration throughout much of northern and eastern Gaul, as Germanic war bands spread across the countryside in search of plunder and suitable settlement sites. The invading peoples employed a strategy of deliberate devastation that targeted Roman infrastructure, administrative centres, and military installations while generally avoiding unnecessary destruction of agricultural resources that they intended to utilise for their own subsistence. Archaeological evidence from Gallic sites of this period reveals widespread destruction of Roman villas, urban centres, and military installations, but continuity in agricultural practices and rural settlement patterns. The Germanic peoples who had crossed the Rhine possessed sophisticated intelligence about Roman territorial organisation and defensive capabilities gathered through decades of contact with Roman merchants, diplomatic envoys, and military deserters. This information allowed them to target strategically important locations while avoiding heavily fortified positions that would require costly siege operations. The Confederation's leadership demonstrated remarkable strategic coordination in dividing Gallic territories among different tribal groups while maintaining overall unity against potential Roman counterattacks. The Vandal contingents moved southward through the Rhone Valley toward the Mediterranean coast, following Roman road networks that facilitated rapid movement while providing access to the wealthy urban centres and agricultural regions of southern Gaul. Their advance created panic among Roman civilian populations who had grown accustomed to frontier security and possessed little experience with barbarian warfare. Many Roman landowners abandoned their estates and fled to fortified cities or across the Alps into Italy, leaving behind substantial wealth and resources that supported the Germanic advance. Simultaneously, Suebi forces moved westward through central Gaul toward the Atlantic coast, occupying territories that had supported prosperous Roman agricultural communities and trading centres. The Suebi demonstrated particular interest in regions suitable for their traditional combination of agriculture and animal husbandry, establishing settlements that combined Germanic farming techniques with Roman agricultural infrastructure. Their occupation of Gallic territories represented not merely military conquest, but the beginning of a fundamental transformation in land use patterns and settlement organisation that would persist for centuries. The Allan contingents utilised their superior mobility to conduct wide-ranging reconnaissance operations that provided intelligence about Roman military movements while disrupting imperial communications and supply lines. Their horsemen appeared suddenly at locations hundreds of kilometres apart, creating the impression of Germanic forces far larger than actually existed and preventing Roman commanders from developing accurate assessments of enemy strength and intentions. This psychological warfare proved as effective as direct military action in undermining Roman resistance and encouraging collaboration with the invading peoples. The success of the Rhine crossing encouraged other Germanic confederations to challenge Roman frontier defences along the Danube and in other frontier regions. The Alemanni, who controlled territories along the Upper Rhine, launched coordinated attacks against Roman positions in Rhaetia and eastern Gaul that forced imperial commanders to divide their already inadequate forces among multiple threatened sectors. The Burgundians, established in territories east of the Rhine near modern Switzerland, negotiated agreements with Roman authorities that granted them formal recognition as federates in exchange for military service against other barbarian peoples. These developments created a cascade effect that fundamentally altered the strategic balance along Rome's northern frontiers. The empire found itself forced to negotiate with Germanic peoples from a position of weakness rather than strength, granting territorial concessions and formal recognition that legitimized barbarian settlement within imperial boundaries. The transformation of Germanic peoples from external enemies to internal federates represented a fundamental change in imperial policy that acknowledged Roman inability to maintain traditional frontier defences through military force alone. The administrative challenge of integrating large Germanic populations within imperial territories required innovative solutions that combined Roman legal traditions with Germanic customary practices. Imperial officials developed new categories of land tenure that granted Germanic peoples usufruct rights to agricultural territories while maintaining theoretical imperial ownership. These arrangements, known as hospitalitas, theoretically provided for the accommodation of Germanic settlers on Roman estates through the allocation of portions of agricultural production and residential facilities. In practice, the implementation of hospitalitas often resulted in the complete displacement of Roman landowners and the establishment of Germanic control over entire regions. The legal fiction of Roman sovereignty provided face-saving formulas for imperial administrators while allowing Germanic peoples to establish autonomous communities that operated according to their traditional social and political structures. This compromise solution enabled the peaceful integration of Germanic populations while avoiding the massive military campaigns that would have been necessary to enforce traditional imperial authority. The cultural transformation that accompanied Germanic settlement in former Roman territories created hybrid societies that combined elements of both traditions while developing new institutions adapted to local conditions. Germanic legal practices, emphasizing personal relationships and customary obligations, merged with Roman administrative procedures to create legal systems that could accommodate diverse populations with different cultural backgrounds. Religious syncretism combined Germanic polytheistic traditions with Christian influences to produce distinctive regional variations that would influence European spiritual development for centuries. The Germanic settlements that had transformed the political landscape of Gaul during the 5th century created opportunities for ambitious tribal confederations to establish territorial dominance over regions that Roman administration could no longer effectively control. Among these emerging powers, the Salian Franks distinguished themselves through their strategic positioning along the lower Rhine Valley and their systematic expansion into territories that commanded crucial river crossings and trade routes connecting the North Sea coast with the interior of Gaul. The Salian Franks derived their name from the Latin salii, meaning the leapers or the dwellers by the saltwater, reflecting their origins in the marshy coastal regions of what is now the Netherlands and northwestern Germany. Archaeological evidence from their homeland reveals a sophisticated material culture that combined traditional Germanic craftsmanship with innovations adopted through extensive contact with Roman merchants and administrators. Excavations at Frankish settlement sites along the Udsel and Meuse rivers have uncovered elaborate metalwork, including cloisonne jewellery and pattern-welded weapons that demonstrate both technical mastery and access to precious materials obtained through long-distance trade networks. The emergence of the Merovingian dynasty among the Salian Franks represented a departure from traditional Germanic political structures that had emphasized collective decision-making through tribal assemblies and the election of war leaders based on demonstrated military success. The Merovingians claimed descent from a legendary sea monster or water spirit named Merovech, whose supernatural origins provided divine legitimacy for their royal authority, while distinguishing them from other Frankish noble families who derived their status from more conventional sources of wealth and military prowess. Merovech himself remains a largely legendary figure, whose historical existence cannot be definitively established through contemporary sources, but whose symbolic importance in Merovingian dynastic ideology demonstrates the sophisticated political mythology that supported Frankish royal authority. Later, Frankish chroniclers described Merovech as possessing supernatural powers that allowed him to communicate with divine spirits and predict the outcomes of military campaigns, characteristics that reflected Germanic beliefs about the sacred nature of kingship and the connection between royal bloodlines and otherworldly forces. The historical record becomes more reliable with Childeric I, who ruled the Salian Franks from approximately 457 to 481 AD, and established the foundations for subsequent Merovingian expansion throughout Gaul. Childeric's tomb, discovered in Tournai in 1653, contained an extraordinary assemblage of grave goods that illuminate both Frankish material culture and the international connections that supported Merovingian power. The burial included a golden bull's head, over 300 golden bees, a crystal ball, and a signet ring bearing Childric's name and title, indicating his recognition by Roman authorities as a legitimate ruler within the imperial framework. The military equipment found in Childric's tomb reveals the sophisticated armament that characterized elite Frankish warriors during the 5th century. His weapons included a pattern-welded sword with elaborate gold and garnet fittings, a Francisca throwing axe with silver inlay work, and a spear with a socketed iron head designed for both thrusting and throwing. The presence of Roman military insignia, alongside traditional Germanic weapons, demonstrates the hybrid nature of Frankish political identity, which combined barbarian military traditions with imperial administrative practices. Childric's political strategy involved careful manipulation of relationships with both Roman authorities and other Germanic peoples to maximize Frankish territorial gains while avoiding conflicts that might threaten the survival of his relatively small tribal confederation. He served as a foederatus under the Roman general Aegidius, providing military assistance against other barbarian peoples in exchange for formal recognition of Frankish settlement rights in territories along the Lower Rhine. This arrangement allowed Childeric to legitimize Frankish territorial expansion while maintaining access to Roman trade networks and diplomatic support. The reign of Clovis I, who succeeded his father Childeric in 481 AD, marked the transformation of the Salian Franks from a regional Germanic confederation into the dominant power in post-Roman Gaul. Clovis possessed exceptional military and political skills that enabled him to exploit the fragmented political situation in Gaul to establish Frankish hegemony over territories stretching from the Rhine to the Pyrenees. His campaigns combined traditional Germanic warfare with innovative tactical adaptations that proved effective against both Roman and barbarian opponents. Clovis's first major military success came in 486 AD with his victory over Syagrius, the last Roman governor in northern Gaul, at the Battle of Soissons. Syagrius had maintained semi-independent control over territories between the Somme and Loire rivers through a combination of Roman administrative continuity and barbarian military support, creating a rump state that served as a buffer between Frankish territories and the Visigothic kingdom in southern Gaul. The elimination of this Roman enclave provided Clovis with control over strategically important territories that included major urban centres and agricultural regions capable of supporting expanded military operations. The tactical innovations that Clovis employed during his campaigns reflected his understanding of the changing nature of warfare in post-Roman Europe. Traditional Germanic battle formations, based on the wedge-shaped charge of heavily armed infantry, proved inadequate against opponents who possessed superior cavalry forces or defensive positions that could not be overcome through frontal assault. Clovis developed combined arms tactics that integrated Frankish infantry with cavalry units recruited from Alan and other nomadic peoples who had settled in Gaul, creating flexible formations capable of adapting to diverse battlefield conditions. The famous incident of the Vase of Soissons, recorded by Gregory of Tours, illustrates both the military culture of the early Frankish kingdom and the political challenges that Clovis faced in establishing royal authority over traditional Germanic warrior bands. Following the capture of Soissons, Frankish warriors divided the plunder according to customary practices that allocated shares based on individual contributions to the victory. When Clovis requested that a particular ceremonial vase be reserved for return to a Christian church, one warrior struck the vessel with his axe, asserting his right to his portion of the spoils regardless of royal preferences. Clovis's response to this challenge demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of the balance between Germanic military traditions and the requirements of centralized royal authority. Rather than immediately punishing the warrior, which might have provoked broader resistance among his followers, Clovis waited until the following year's military review to strike down the offending warrior with his own axe, declaring that the man's weapons were inadequately maintained. This calculated demonstration of royal power served notice that Clovis would not tolerate challenges to his authority while respecting the forms of traditional Germanic military culture. The expansion of Frankish power under Clovis required careful attention to the religious and cultural sensibilities of the diverse populations that came under his rule. The territories that the Franks conquered contained substantial numbers of Gallo-Roman Christians who had maintained their religious practices despite the collapse of imperial administration, as well as various Germanic peoples who retained traditional polytheistic beliefs. The religious policies that Clovis adopted would prove crucial in determining whether these populations would accept Frankish rule or resist it as foreign domination. The conversion of Clovis to Catholic Christianity around 508 AD represented a calculated political decision that transformed the religious landscape of early medieval Europe and established the foundation for the alliance between Frankish monarchy and the Roman Church that would influence European development for centuries. Unlike most other Germanic rulers who had adopted Arian Christianity through contact with Gothic missionaries, Clovis chose to embrace the Catholic faith practiced by the majority of his Gallo-Roman subjects. The circumstances surrounding Clovis's conversion, as recorded by Gregory of Tours, involved his marriage to Clotilde, a Burgundian princess who had remained Catholic despite her people's official Arianism, and his subsequent victory over the Alemanni at the Battle of Tolbiac. According to Gregory's account, Clovis promised to convert to his wife's faith if her god granted him victory in the battle, a narrative that parallels Constantine's conversion before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge and reflects the political utility of divine sanction for military success. The baptism of Clovis, performed by Bishop Remigius of Reims in a ceremony that deliberately evoked imperial coronation rituals, established precedents for the relationship between Frankish monarchy and Christian ecclesiastical authority that would influence European political development throughout the medieval period. The bishop's alleged words to Clovis, "Bow your head humbly, Sir Cambrian. Worship what you have burned. Burn what you have worshipped," symbolically represented the transformation of Germanic warrior culture through Christian influence, while acknowledging the continuity of royal authority under the new religious dispensation. The political implications of Clovis's conversion extended far beyond personal religious conviction to encompass fundamental changes in the basis of royal legitimacy and the relationship between Frankish rulers and their subjects. Catholic Christianity provided Clovis with ideological tools for justifying his authority that transcended traditional Germanic concepts based on kinship, military prowess, and tribal consent. The Christian concept of divinely ordained monarchy offered theoretical foundations for centralized royal power that could override tribal particularism and customary limitations on royal authority. The conversion also provided Clovis with powerful allies among the Catholic episcopate throughout Gaul, who possessed substantial influence over urban populations and controlled significant economic resources through church lands and ecclesiastical privileges. Bishops like Avitus of Vienne and Caesarius of Arles became active supporters of Frankish expansion, viewing Clovis as a champion of Orthodox Christianity against Arian heretics and pagan barbarians. This clerical support proved crucial in legitimizing Frankish rule over Gallo-Roman populations who might otherwise have resisted Germanic domination. The military advantages that resulted from Clovis's conversion became apparent during his subsequent campaigns against the Visigothic kingdom in southwestern Gaul. The Visigothic rulers, who adhered to Arian Christianity, found themselves religiously isolated from their Catholic subjects and unable to mobilize the same level of popular support that Clovis enjoyed among Gallo-Roman Christians. The ideological dimension of the conflict, framed as a struggle between Orthodox and heretical Christianity, provided Clovis with propaganda advantages that complemented his military capabilities. The Battle of Vuil in 507 AD demonstrated the effectiveness of the combined military and religious strategy that Clovis had developed during his reign. The Frankish army that defeated the Visigothic forces under Alaric II included not only traditional Germanic warriors but also Gallo-Roman recruits who viewed the campaign as a religious crusade against heretical rulers. The death of Alaric II during the battle eliminated effective Visigothic resistance and opened the way for Frankish occupation of territories extending to the Pyrenees. The consolidation of Frankish power throughout Gaul required administrative innovations that could effectively govern the diverse populations and territories that had come under Merovingian rule. Clovis adapted Roman administrative practices to Germanic political traditions, creating hybrid institutions that maintained the efficiency of imperial bureaucracy while accommodating the personal relationships and customary obligations that characterized Germanic society. The appointment of counts to govern territorial districts combined Roman administrative titles with Germanic concepts of personal loyalty to the king. The legal framework that emerged under Clovis reflected similar hybrid characteristics, combining Germanic customary law with Roman legal principles to create systems that could accommodate the diverse legal traditions of Frankish subjects. The Salic law, codified during Clovis's reign, established standardized procedures for resolving disputes and punishing crimes while maintaining the Germanic emphasis on compensation rather than corporal punishment. The law's provisions regarding inheritance, which excluded women from inheriting certain types of property, would later influence the succession practices of European monarchies for centuries. The territorial expansion that characterized Clovis's reign established the geographical foundations for subsequent Frankish dominance in Western Europe. By the time of his death in 511 AD, Frankish authority extended from the Rhine Valley to the Pyrenees and from the English Channel to the Rhone River, encompassing territories that included some of the most economically productive and strategically important regions of the former Western Roman Empire. This territorial base provided the resources necessary to support the military forces and administrative apparatus required for continued expansion and consolidation. The division of the Frankish kingdom among Clovis's sons according to Germanic inheritance practices created political fragmentation that would characterize Merovingian rule for the following 2 centuries. The creation of separate kingdoms centered on Paris, Orléans, Reims, and Soissons reflected traditional Germanic concepts of royal authority as personal property that could be divided among heirs, but also created opportunities for internal conflict and external intervention that would ultimately weaken Merovingian power and create opportunities for the rise of alternative power centres. The political instability that resulted from Merovingian succession practices provided opportunities for ambitious aristocratic families to accumulate power and influence at the expense of royal authority. The office of Mayor of the Palace, originally an administrative position responsible for managing royal households, gradually evolved into the effective centre of political power as Merovingian kings became increasingly ceremonial figures. The Pippinid family, later known as the Carolingians, emerged as the most successful of these aristocratic dynasties through their control of the mayoralty in Austrasia, the eastern portion of the Frankish kingdom. Charles Martel, who served as mayor of the palace from 718 to 741 AD, represented the culmination of Carolingian efforts to establish effective control over Frankish territories while maintaining the fiction of Merovingian royal legitimacy. His military and political achievements laid the groundwork for the eventual Carolingian usurpation of royal authority and the establishment of a new dynasty that would dominate European politics for centuries. Charles's cognomen Martel, meaning the hammer, reflected his reputation as an effective military commander who could defeat enemies through decisive battlefield action. The most famous of Charles Martel's military victories occurred at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, where Frankish forces defeated a Muslim army that had crossed the Pyrenees from Al-Andalus and advanced deep into Aquitaine. The strategic significance of this victory extended beyond its immediate military consequences to encompass fundamental questions about the religious and cultural identity of medieval Europe. The defeat of the Muslim forces prevented the potential establishment of Islamic political control over additional European territories, and reinforced the association between Frankish military power and Christian religious identity. The Muslim forces that Charles Martel confronted at Tours represented the northernmost extension of the rapid Islamic expansion that had transformed the political landscape of the Mediterranean world during the 7th and 8th centuries. Following their conquest of Visigothic Spain, Muslim commanders had launched raids across the Pyrenees to test Frankish military capabilities and explore opportunities for further territorial expansion. The army that advanced toward Tours included both Arab cavalry and Berber infantry, supported by siege equipment and supply trains that indicated serious intentions for permanent conquest rather than temporary raiding. The tactical innovations that Charles Martel employed at Tours demonstrated his understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of both Frankish and Muslim military systems. Rather than employing traditional Germanic charge tactics that might have proven vulnerable to Muslim cavalry mobility, Charles positioned his forces in a defensive formation that utilized the terrain to limit enemy maneuverability while maximizing the effectiveness of Frankish heavy infantry. The battle lasted several days, with Muslim forces repeatedly attempting to break through Frankish defensive lines without achieving decisive results. The death of Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the Muslim commander, during the final day of fighting at Tours eliminated the leadership necessary to maintain Muslim offensive operations and forced the surviving Muslim forces to withdraw across the Pyrenees. The psychological impact of this victory resonated throughout Christian Europe, where it was interpreted as divine vindication of Frankish claims to serve as defenders of Christendom against Islamic expansion. Contemporary chroniclers described the battle in apocalyptic terms that emphasized its religious significance while acknowledging Charles Martel's military skill and leadership. The political consequences of the victory at Tours extended Charles Martel's influence throughout the Frankish kingdom and established his reputation as the effective ruler of Frankish territories despite his technically subordinate position as mayor of the palace. The success of his defensive strategy against Muslim forces demonstrated the effectiveness of Carolingian military organization and provided a model for subsequent campaigns against other external enemies. The victory also strengthened Charles's relationships with ecclesiastical authorities, who viewed him as a champion of Christian civilization against Islamic expansion. The administrative and military reforms that Charles Martel implemented during his tenure as mayor of the palace created the institutional foundations for subsequent Carolingian expansion and the eventual establishment of formal royal authority. His reorganization of Frankish military forces emphasized the development of heavy cavalry units that could match the mobility of enemy forces while maintaining the striking power necessary for decisive battlefield victories. The recruitment and maintenance of these cavalry forces required substantial economic resources that Charles obtained through the systematic appropriation of church lands and the redistribution of ecclesiastical wealth to support military objectives. The relationship between Charles Martel and ecclesiastical authorities remained complex and sometimes antagonistic, despite their shared commitment to defending Christian territories against external threats. His confiscation of church properties to support military expenses created tensions with bishops and abbots who viewed these actions as violations of ecclesiastical privileges and threats to the economic foundations of Christian institutions. However, the military successes that resulted from these policies ultimately vindicated Charles's approach and established precedents for subsequent Carolingian relationships with the Church. The succession of Pepin the Short to the position of mayor of the palace in 741 AD marked the beginning of the final phase of Carolingian consolidation of power and the preparation for the formal usurpation of Merovingian royal authority. Pepin possessed both the military capabilities necessary to maintain Frankish territorial integrity and the political sophistication required to negotiate the complex relationships with ecclesiastical authorities, aristocratic families, and foreign powers that would legitimize Carolingian claims to royal status. The papal alliance that Pepin negotiated during the 750s represented a revolutionary development in European political relationships that established new precedents for the interaction between secular and ecclesiastical authority. Pope Stephen II's journey across the Alps to meet with Pepin in 754 AD marked the first time that a pope had personally travelled beyond the Alps to negotiate with a barbarian ruler, indicating the desperate circumstances that faced the papacy as a result of Lombard expansion in Italy and the inability of Byzantine authorities to provide effective protection for papal territories. The agreements that resulted from these negotiations created mutual obligations that would influence European political development for centuries. Pepin promised to protect papal territories against Lombard aggression and to restore lands that had been seized from the Church, while Stephen II provided religious sanction for Carolingian claims to royal authority and performed a second coronation ceremony that reinforced the divine legitimacy of Pepin's rule. The donation of Pepin, which granted the papacy temporal authority over territories in central Italy, established the Papal States as a political entity that would persist until the 19th century. The deposition of Childeric III, the last Merovingian king in 751 AD, formalised the Carolingian Revolution and established Pepin the Short as the founder of a new royal dynasty. The ceremonial aspects of this transition carefully balance respect for traditional Germanic political customs with innovations that reflected the Christian character of Carolingian royal ideology. The election of Pepin by an assembly of Frankish nobles maintained the fiction of popular consent that had characterized Germanic kingship, while his anointing by ecclesiastical authorities introduced biblical precedents for divinely sanctioned monarchy. The coronation of Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans on Christmas Day 800 AD represented the culmination of a systematic campaign of territorial expansion and religious conversion that had transformed the political landscape of Northern Europe through 3 decades of relentless warfare against the Saxon peoples. The foundations for this imperial achievement had been laid during the preceding quarter century through a series of military campaigns that demonstrated both the tactical evolution of Frankish military organisation and the ideological fusion of territorial conquest with Christian missionary activity that would characterise medieval European expansion for centuries. The Saxon territories that Charlemagne targeted for conquest encompassed a vast region stretching from the Weser River in the west to the Elbe River in the east, and from the North Sea coast in the north to the Harz Mountains in the south. This landscape of dense forests, marshy river valleys, and scattered agricultural clearings had supported Germanic tribal communities for over a millennium, developing distinctive political and religious institutions that had successfully resisted Roman expansion during the height of imperial power. Archaeological evidence from Saxon settlement sites reveals sophisticated material culture that combined traditional Germanic craftsmanship with innovations adopted through trade contacts with Frankish, Frisian, and Scandinavian neighbours. The Saxon peoples who inhabited these territories maintained tribal confederations that operated according to political structures similar to those that Tacitus had described among other Germanic peoples, but with distinctive characteristics that reflected their particular historical development and geographical circumstances. The Westphalians controlled territories along the Weser River and its tributaries, where they had developed agricultural techniques adapted to the heavy clay soils and frequent flooding that characterized the region. Their settlements featured substantial timber-framed buildings with elaborate post and beam construction that required sophisticated carpentry skills and coordinated community labour for construction and maintenance. The Engen occupied the central Saxon territories between the Weser and Elbe rivers, where they maintained a mixed economy that combined agriculture with extensive cattle and horse breeding operations. Their political organisation emphasised the authority of noble families who controlled strategic river crossings and maintained fortified settlements that served as centres for trade and military coordination. Archaeological excavations at Engen sites have revealed substantial weapon hoards and imported luxury goods that indicate both military preparedness and participation in long-distance trade networks extending to the Baltic Sea and the Rhineland. The Eastphalians controlled territories along the Elbe River and its eastern tributaries, where their settlements represented the easternmost extension of Saxon political authority and cultural influence. Their strategic position along trade routes connecting the North Sea with Slavic territories to the east provided opportunities for commercial activities that supported military capabilities and political autonomy. Eastphalian material culture displays influences from Slavic and other Eastern European peoples, indicating extensive cultural exchange and intermarriage that created hybrid communities with complex ethnic and political identities. Saxon religious practices centered on the worship of traditional Germanic deities and the maintenance of sacred sites that had served as focal points for tribal identity and political organization for centuries. The most significant of these religious centers was the Irminsul, a massive wooden pillar or sacred tree that served as the primary cult object for Saxon religious observances and the symbolic representation of their connection to divine forces. Contemporary sources describe the Irminsul as reaching extraordinary heights and serving as the axis around which Saxon cosmological beliefs were organized, connecting the earthly realm with divine powers and ancestral spirits. The religious significance of the Irminsul extended beyond its role as a cult object to encompass its function as a symbol of Saxon political independence and cultural identity. Tribal assemblies gathered at the site for important religious festivals and political deliberations, while warriors took oaths of loyalty and sought divine blessing for military campaigns in its presence. The maintenance of the Irminsul required substantial community resources and specialized knowledge of ritual procedures, creating networks of religious specialists and political authorities who derived legitimacy from their association with sacred traditions. Saxon military organization reflected their tribal political structure while adapting to the tactical requirements of defending their territories against Frankish expansion. Saxon warriors employed traditional Germanic weapons including spears, swords and shields, but had developed specialized techniques for fighting in the forested and marshy terrain that characterized their homeland. Their defensive strategies emphasized the use of natural obstacles and fortified positions that could channel enemy advances into predetermined killing zones where Saxon tactical advantages could be maximized. The Saxon practice of constructing earthwork fortifications at strategic locations throughout their territories provided defensive capabilities that complemented their tactical emphasis on mobility and local knowledge. These fortifications, known as burhs in Saxon terminology, featured sophisticated engineering that combined earth ramparts with wooden palisades and strategic placement of obstacles that could disrupt cavalry charges and siege operations. Archaeological investigation of Saxon fortifications reveals construction techniques that required extensive community labour and engineering expertise, indicating sophisticated military planning and resource allocation capabilities. Charlemagne's decision to launch systematic campaigns against Saxon territories reflected both strategic calculations about Frankish security requirements and ideological commitments to expanding Christian influence that had become central to Carolingian royal identity. The Saxon territories commanded crucial river valleys and trade routes that connected the Frankish kingdom with the Baltic Sea and Scandinavian markets, while Saxon military capabilities posed potential threats to Frankish settlements along the Rhine frontier. The combination of economic opportunity and security concerns provided practical justifications for military action that complemented religious motivations for converting pagan peoples to Christianity. The initial Frankish campaigns against Saxon territories began in 772 AD, with coordinated attacks against multiple Saxon strongholds designed to demonstrate Carolingian military capabilities while disrupting Saxon defensive preparations. Charlemagne personally led the main Frankish army against the Erzberg, a fortified Saxon settlement that controlled strategic approaches to the interior of Saxon territory. The Siege of Erzberg revealed both Frankish tactical innovations and Saxon defensive capabilities, as Carolingian forces employed siege engines and coordinated infantry assaults against Saxon earthwork fortifications defended by warriors fighting from prepared positions. The capture of Erzberg provided Charlemagne with his first major victory against Saxon resistance and demonstrated the effectiveness of Frankish siege techniques against Saxon fortifications. The aftermath of the siege included the systematic destruction of Saxon defensive works and the establishment of a Frankish garrison that could monitor Saxon activities and support subsequent military operations. More significantly, the victory allowed Frankish forces to advance against the Irminsul itself, the destruction of which would strike at the heart of Saxon religious and political identity. The destruction of the Irminsul represented more than a military objective. It constituted a deliberate assault on the spiritual foundations of Saxon resistance to Frankish expansion. Contemporary chronicles describe the enormous effort required to fell the sacred pillar and the substantial treasure that Charlemagne's forces discovered in the associated religious complex. The gold, silver and precious objects that had accumulated through centuries of religious offerings provided immediate material benefits that helped finance continued military operations. While the symbolic impact of destroying the most sacred Saxon religious sites sent clear messages about the futility of resistance to Frankish power, the Saxon response to these initial Frankish successes demonstrated both their military capabilities and their determination to maintain political independence. Despite the overwhelming advantages that Carolingian forces possessed in terms of numbers, equipment, and logistical support, Saxon war leaders organised coordinated counterattacks that exploited their superior knowledge of local terrain and their ability to mobilise quickly for defensive operations. These counterattacks achieved significant tactical successes that inflicted substantial casualties on Frankish forces and demonstrated that Saxon resistance would require prolonged military commitment rather than quick decisive victories. The emergence of Widukind as the primary leader of Saxon resistance marked a crucial turning point in the conflict that transformed sporadic tribal warfare into systematic military campaigns guided by sophisticated strategic planning. Widukind possessed exceptional military and political skills that enabled him to coordinate resistance activities among different Saxon tribal groups while maintaining effective communication with potential allies beyond Saxon territories. His leadership provided Saxon resistance with the unity and strategic direction necessary to sustain prolonged warfare against superior Frankish military resources. Widukind's background reflected the complex political and cultural circumstances that characterised Saxon society during the 8th century. Archaeological evidence suggests that he belonged to a noble family that controlled territories along the Weser River and maintained extensive connections with other Germanic peoples through marriage alliances and trade relationships. His material culture, as revealed through grave goods and settlement remains associated with his family, displays influences from Frisian, Danish, and other Northern European sources that indicate participation in broader cultural networks that extended well beyond Saxon territorial boundaries. The military strategies that Widukind employed against Frankish forces demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both Saxon tactical advantages and Carolingian military weaknesses. Rather than attempting to match Frankish forces in direct confrontations that would favour Carolingian numerical superiority and superior equipment, Widukind organised guerrilla warfare campaigns that exploited Saxon mobility and local knowledge while avoiding decisive battles that might result in catastrophic defeats. These tactics required careful coordination among multiple Saxon groups and precise timing that could maximize damage to Frankish forces while minimizing Saxon casualties. Widukin's political strategy involved efforts to maintain Saxon tribal unity while seeking external support from other peoples who viewed Frankish expansion as threats to their own independence. His diplomatic initiatives reached Danish and Slavic leaders who possessed military capabilities that could complement Saxon resistance efforts, while his propaganda emphasized the religious and cultural dimensions of the conflicts that portrayed Frankish campaigns as attempts to destroy traditional Germanic civilization. These efforts achieved significant success in maintaining Saxon morale and attracting material support for continued resistance activities. The religious dimensions of Saxon resistance under Widukin's leadership reflected the central role that traditional Germanic religious practices played in maintaining tribal identity and political cohesion. The destruction of the Irminsul had eliminated the primary focus of Saxon religious observances, but Widukind and other Saxon leaders worked to maintain traditional religious practices through the establishment of alternative sacred sites and the preservation of ritual knowledge among Saxon religious specialists. These efforts served both spiritual and political purposes, as they provided focal points for tribal unity while demonstrating continued rejection of Christian religious authority. Saxon religious practices during this period emphasized the worship of war deities and the performance of ritual activities that sought divine support for military resistance against Frankish invasion. Archaeological evidence from Saxon religious sites reveals substantial deposits of weapons and military equipment that indicate sacrificial offerings designed to secure divine favour for military campaigns. These ritual practices reinforce the connection between religious devotion and political resistance, while providing psychological support for warriors facing overwhelming odds against superior enemy forces. The Frankish response to Saxon resistance tactics required significant adaptations in military organisation and strategic planning that reflected the challenges of conducting prolonged campaigns in hostile territory against opponents who possessed superior local knowledge and high motivation for continued resistance. Charlemagne reorganised his military forces to emphasise mobility and logistical sustainability, creating smaller units that could operate independently while maintaining communication with main army groups. These organisational changes required substantial investments in equipment and training that strained Frankish financial resources while providing tactical flexibility necessary for effective counterinsurgency operations. The establishment of Frankish fortified positions throughout Saxon territories represented a systematic effort to create permanent military presence that could monitor Saxon activities and provide bases for continued offensive operations. These fortifications, constructed at strategic river crossings and along major transportation routes, featured sophisticated defensive designs that incorporated both Roman engineering principles and Germanic tactical innovations. The construction and maintenance of these installations required substantial human and material resources that demonstrated Carolingian commitment to permanent conquest rather than temporary military occupation. The garrisoning of these Frankish fortifications created ongoing logistical challenges that required regular supply convoys and communication networks extending back to Frankish-based territories. Saxon forces under Widukin's leadership targeted these supply lines and isolated garrisons through coordinated attacks that sought to make the cost of maintaining Frankish military presence prohibitively expensive. These attacks achieved significant tactical successes that forced Charlemagne to commit additional military resources to defensive operations while limiting the forces available for offensive campaigns. The conversion efforts that accompanied Frankish military operations represented systematic attempts to undermine the religious foundations of Saxon resistance. while providing alternative sources of political legitimacy for Carolingian rule. Frankish missionaries, protected by military escorts and supported by material incentives for conversion, established churches and monasteries at strategic locations throughout Saxon territories. These religious institutions served both spiritual and political functions, as they provided centres for Christian religious instruction, while creating networks of converts who might support Frankish political authority against continued Saxon resistance. The missionary activities directed at Saxon populations employed a combination of persuasion and coercion that reflected Carolingian understanding of the relationship between religious conversion and political submission. Frankish religious authorities offered material benefits, including food, clothing and protection to Saxons who accepted Christian baptism, while threatening punishment and exclusion from trade opportunities for those who maintained traditional religious practices. These policies created divisions within Saxon communities between those who sought accommodation with Frankish authority and those who continued to support armed resistance under Widukin's leadership. The mass baptisms that Frankish sources describe as occurring throughout Saxon territories during the 770s represented complex political and religious phenomena that involved varying degrees of genuine religious conversion, political calculation, and simple survival strategy. Archaeological evidence suggests that many Saxons who underwent Christian baptism continued to maintain traditional religious practices in private settings, creating syncretic religious systems that combined Christian and Germanic elements. These hybrid religious practices reflected the incomplete nature of Frankish cultural conquest and the persistence of Saxon identity despite political submission. The massacre of Verdun in 782 AD represented the most extreme manifestation of Charlemagne's frustration with continued Saxon resistance and his determination to eliminate opposition through systematic terror. The execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners, conducted in a single day following their surrender after a military defeat, violated both Germanic and Christian traditions regarding the treatment of prisoners of war, and demonstrated the extent to which the prolonged conflict had brutalized participants on both sides. The circumstances that led to the Verdun massacre reflected the escalating cycle of violence that had characterized the Saxon wars, as both sides adopted increasingly harsh tactics in response to their opponents' actions. Saxon forces had achieved significant victories against Frankish armies during 782, including the destruction of substantial Carolingian military units and the killing of prominent Frankish nobles. These Saxon successes had encouraged broader resistance activities and threatened to undo the political gains that Charlemagne had achieved through previous military campaigns. The Frankish military response to these Saxon victories involved the mobilization of substantially larger forces than had been employed in previous campaigns, including contingents drawn from throughout the Carolingian kingdom and allied peoples who owed military service to Charlemagne. The scale of this military commitment reflected both the strategic importance that Charlemagne attached to Saxon conquest and his recognition that half measures would not achieve decisive results against determined Saxon resistance. The army that advanced into Saxon territory during 782 possessed overwhelming numerical superiority and siege capabilities that could overcome any Saxon defensive positions. The surrender of Saxon forces at Verdun occurred after their defeat in a pitched battle that had demonstrated the futility of continued military resistance against superior Frankish numbers and equipment. The Saxon warriors who laid down their weapons apparently expected treatment according to traditional Germanic customs that provided for the ransom or exchange of prisoners rather than mass execution. The decision to execute these prisoners represented a deliberate departure from established military practices and reflected Charlemagne's calculation that extreme measures were necessary to break Saxon resistance permanently. The methods employed during the Verdun executions revealed the systematic planning that had preceded the massacre and the ideological justifications that Carolingian authorities used to legitimize their actions. The prisoners were executed by beheading, a method that avoided the ritual pollution associated with other forms of killing, while providing efficient means for dispatching large numbers of victims. Frankish sources describe the executions as divine judgment against pagan resistance to Christian authority, framing the massacre in religious terms that portrayed Charlemagne as an instrument of divine wrath against enemies of the faith. The immediate consequences of the Verden massacre included the temporary collapse of organised Saxon resistance, as surviving Saxon leaders fled to territories beyond Frankish control or sought accommodation with Carolingian authorities through formal submission and conversion to Christianity. The psychological impact of the executions resonated throughout Saxon territories and demonstrated the costs of continued resistance against Frankish expansion. However, the long-term effects of the massacre included the creation of deep resentments that would fuel renewed resistance activities and complicate subsequent efforts at political integration. The international reaction to the Verden massacre reflected the extent to which Charlemagne's actions had violated established norms regarding warfare and religious conversion that were recognised throughout medieval Europe. Contemporary chroniclers, including those generally supportive of Carolingian expansion, expressed reservations about the methods employed at Verden and questioned whether mass execution served legitimate religious or political objectives. These criticisms suggested that the massacre had damaged Charlemagne's reputation as a Christian ruler and created diplomatic complications with other European powers. The resumption of Saxon resistance following Verden demonstrated both the resilience of Saxon political organisation and the limitations of terror as a tool for achieving permanent political submission. Widukind, who had escaped the massacre through his absence from the defeated Saxon forces, reorganised resistance activities with support from Danish allies, who provided military assistance and territorial bases beyond Frankish reach. The renewed Saxon military campaigns that began in 783 achieved significant tactical successes that forced Charlemagne to commit additional resources to Saxon conquest while delaying his planned campaigns in other theatres. The establishment of the Holy Roman Empire through Otto III's coronation in 962 AD represented the culmination of Germanic political evolution from tribal confederations to centralised monarchical authority, yet this transformation preserved distinctly Teutonic institutional structures that would shape European governance for nearly a millennium. The empire that emerged under Saxon leadership differed fundamentally from its Carolingian predecessor through its systematic integration of Germanic legal traditions, its accommodation of regional tribal identities within imperial structures, and its development of administrative mechanisms that balanced centralised authority with local autonomy. The political foundations for Otto's imperial coronation had been established during the preceding century through the gradual consolidation of Saxon royal authority over the German stem duchies and the successful defence of Germanic territories against Magyar invasions from the east and Slavic expansion from the north. The Saxon dynasty that emerged from the collapse of Carolingian authority in the Eastern Frankish kingdom possessed both the military capabilities necessary to maintain territorial integrity and the political sophistication required to negotiate complex relationships with powerful ducal families who controlled substantial autonomous territories. Henry the Fowler, Otto's father and the founder of the Saxon royal dynasty, had demonstrated exceptional skill in managing the delicate balance between royal prerogatives and ducal autonomy that characterized the German political system during the 10th century. His election as king by the German nobles in 919 AD established precedents for consensual monarchy that distinguished Germanic political practices from the increasingly autocratic tendencies that characterized other European kingdoms. The electoral process that elevated Henry to royal authority involved extensive negotiations among the major ducal families and required formal agreements that limited royal power while providing mechanisms for coordinated action during military emergencies. The stem duchies that formed the core of the emerging German kingdom represented the political evolution of ancient Germanic tribal confederations into territorial principalities that maintained distinct cultural identities while participating in broader imperial structures. Bavaria, the largest and most autonomous of these duchies, controlled territories extending from the Danube River to the Alpine passes that connected German lands with Italy. The Bavarian dukes maintained their own military forces, legal systems, and diplomatic relationships with neighbouring powers, creating a state within a state that possessed many attributes of sovereign authority while acknowledging nominal royal supremacy. The Bavarian political system reflected the successful adaptation of Germanic tribal institutions to the administrative requirements of governing substantial territories that contained diverse populations and complex economic relationships. The ducal court at Regensburg functioned as both a ceremonial centre that maintained traditional Germanic royal practices and an administrative headquarters that coordinated military operations, judicial proceedings, and diplomatic negotiations throughout Bavarian territories. The Duke's household included specialised officials responsible for military organisation, legal administration, and financial management who possessed technical expertise that rivaled the capabilities of royal administrators in other European kingdoms. Bavarian legal traditions preserved Germanic customary practices while incorporating innovations necessary for governing settled agricultural populations and urban commercial centres that had developed during the post-Carolingian period. The Bavarian law codes that emerged during the 10th century combined traditional Germanic emphasis on compensation for injuries and crimes with Roman legal principles regarding property rights and contractual obligations. These hybrid legal systems provided frameworks for resolving disputes between different ethnic and social groups, while maintaining the personal character of Germanic law that emphasized relationships between individuals rather than abstract legal principles. The military organization of Bavaria reflected both its frontier position facing Magyar and Slavic threats and its role as a major component of German royal military capabilities. Bavarian forces included heavily armoured cavalry units equipped with superior weapons and horses that could match the tactical capabilities of Magyar mounted archers, while maintaining traditional Germanic infantry formations that provided stability during defensive operations. The fortified settlements that protected Bavarian territories featured sophisticated defensive architecture that combined Germanic earthwork construction techniques with innovations adapted from Byzantine and Islamic military engineering. Swabia, occupying the southwestern regions of the German kingdom, controlled territories that included some of the most economically productive agricultural lands and strategically important trade routes connecting the Rhine Valley with Italian markets. The Swabian dukes maintained close relationships with ecclesiastical authorities who controlled substantial territories and resources within the duchy, creating political alliances that strengthened ducal authority while providing religious legitimacy for Swabian autonomy within the broader German political system. The economic foundations of Swabian political power included extensive agricultural estates that produced surplus grain and livestock for regional markets, as well as control over Alpine passes that generated substantial revenues through customs duties and protection fees charged to merchants travelling between German and Italian territories. The Swabian ducal administration developed sophisticated financial management systems that could coordinate resource allocation across diverse economic activities while maintaining military capabilities necessary for defending territorial integrity and supporting royal military campaigns. Swabian military traditions emphasized the development of siege warfare capabilities that reflected the duchy's strategic position, controlling fortified positions along major transportation routes. Swabian forces included specialized engineers and artillery specialists who possessed technical knowledge regarding the construction and operation of siege engines, catapults, and other mechanical devices necessary for conducting successful siege operations. These technical capabilities proved crucial during campaigns against Magyar, fortified positions, and provided valuable support for royal military operations throughout the German kingdom. Franconia, centred on the main river valley, represented the heartland of former Carolingian authority in the Eastern Frankish kingdom and maintained institutional continuities with imperial administrative practices that had been developed during the 8th and 9th centuries. The Franconian dukes possessed extensive ecclesiastical connections that provided both political support and substantial economic resources through their control over numerous monasteries and cathedral chapters that owned substantial territories throughout central Germany. The Franconian political system preserved many characteristics of Carolingian administrative organisation while adapting these institutions to the more decentralised political environment that emerged following the collapse of unified Carolingian authority. Franconian ducal courts maintained elaborate ceremonial practices that emphasised continuity with imperial traditions, while developing new institutional mechanisms that could coordinate activities among multiple territorial jurisdictions and diverse social groups. Franconian legal traditions reflected the duchy's position as a bridge between different Germanic legal systems and its role in maintaining institutional continuities with Carolingian legal practices. The Franconian law codes that developed during the 10th century provided models for other German duchies while establishing precedents for imperial legal authority that would influence subsequent development of German royal judicial powers. These legal innovations included procedures for resolving disputes between different ducal jurisdictions and mechanisms for coordinating military obligations among various territorial authorities. Saxony, the homeland of the royal dynasty, occupied territories extending from the Rhine to the Elbe rivers and maintained distinctive political institutions that reflected both ancient Germanic tribal traditions and the administrative innovations necessary for governing the most militarily active region of the German kingdom. Saxon political organisation emphasised the authority of local assemblies that retained substantial decision-making powers regarding military service, taxation, and legal proceedings, creating democratic elements within the broader hierarchical structure of ducal authority. The Saxon military system provided the foundation for royal military capabilities throughout the German kingdom and established tactical innovations that proved decisive during campaigns against Magyar and Slavic opponents. Saxon cavalry units employed heavy armour and specialised weapons that could engage enemy forces in direct combat, while Saxon infantry formations maintained a traditional Germanic tactical flexibility that allowed rapid adaptation to changing battlefield conditions. The Saxon military organisation included specialised units responsible for siege operations, reconnaissance activities, and logistical support that provided comprehensive military capabilities. Saxon legal traditions preserved many ancient Germanic practices regarding personal relationships and customary obligations, while developing innovative procedures for integrating diverse populations that had settled within Saxon territories during the migration period and subsequent centuries. The Saxon legal system emphasised the authority of local assemblies and customary law, while providing mechanisms for appealing local decisions to ducal and royal authorities. These legal arrangements created multiple levels of judicial authority that could accommodate different legal traditions while maintaining overall systemic coherence. Lotharingia, the westernmost of the German duchies, occupied territories that had been contested between German and French royal authority since the division of the Carolingian Empire, and maintained complex political relationships that reflected its position as a frontier region between different political and cultural systems. The Lotharingian dukes possessed substantial autonomy in conducting diplomatic relationships with French and Burgundian authorities while maintaining military obligations to German royal authority that required careful balancing of competing loyalties and interests. The political institutions that developed in Lotharingia reflected the necessity of accommodating diverse populations that included Germanic, Romance and Celtic elements, each with distinct legal traditions and cultural practices. Lotharingian ducal administration developed sophisticated mechanisms for managing multicultural territories while maintaining political unity and military effectiveness. These administrative innovations included specialized courts for different ethnic groups and procedures for coordinating activities among various local authorities who possessed different legal and political traditions. Lotharingian military organization emphasized defensive capabilities that could protect the duchy's extensive frontier territories, while providing mobile forces that could support royal military campaigns in other regions. Lotharingian forces included cavalry units equipped for rapid movement across diverse terrain and infantry formations trained in siege warfare techniques necessary for defending and capturing fortified positions along the contested frontiers with French territories. The imperial coronation of Otto then in 962 AD represented the culmination of a systematic campaign to establish German royal authority over Italian territories, while maintaining effective control over the German duchies through a combination of military pressure, diplomatic negotiation, and institutional innovation. Otto's Italian campaigns had demonstrated German military superiority over both Italian political authorities and Byzantine forces, while his marriage alliances with prominent Italian noble families had created political networks that supported German imperial claims. The circumstances surrounding Otto's coronation reflected the complex relationship between imperial authority and papal political objectives that had characterized Italian politics since the collapse of Carolingian control over the peninsula. Pope John XIV's decision to crown Otto as emperor resulted from his desperate need for military protection against the Lombard king Berengar II, who had threatened papal territorial integrity and political autonomy. The papal-imperial alliance that emerged from these negotiations established precedents for church-state relationships that would influence European political development for centuries. The imperial title that Otto assumed differed significantly from both the Carolingian imperial precedent and contemporary Byzantine imperial authority through its explicit connection to Germanic political traditions and its integration of German ducal structures within imperial administrative systems. The Holy Roman Empire that emerged under Otto's leadership preserved the autonomy of the German stem duchies, while creating mechanisms for coordinated imperial action that could mobilize resources from throughout the German kingdom for military campaigns and diplomatic initiatives. The administrative innovations that Otto implemented to govern his expanded imperial territories required careful balancing of German political traditions with the practical requirements of ruling diverse populations across vast geographical distances. The imperial court that Otto established maintained itinerant characteristics that reflected Germanic royal traditions, while developing specialized administrative departments that could coordinate activities among different territorial jurisdictions and cultural regions. The development of the ministeriales system represented one of the most significant institutional innovations that emerged during the early Holy Roman Empire and demonstrated the distinctive character of Germanic political evolution. The ministeriales were unfree knights who served imperial and ducal authorities in administrative and military capacities, while possessing substantial practical authority and social status that distinguished them from other servile populations. This institution provided Germanic rulers with loyal administrative personnel who could not establish independent political bases while creating opportunities for social mobility that maintained political stability. The legal status of ministeriales reflected the complex social hierarchies that characterized Germanic society and the practical requirements of governing territories that required specialized administrative capabilities. Unlike free knights who possessed independent political rights and could challenge royal authority through legal and military means, ministeriales derived their authority entirely from their relationships with royal or ducal masters and could be removed from office without the complex legal procedures required for dealing with free nobles. The ministerialis system provided Germanic rulers with administrative capabilities that could compete with the more sophisticated bureaucratic systems that characterized Byzantine and Islamic political organization while maintaining the personal relationships that formed the foundation of Germanic political authority. The ministeriales served as judges, military commanders, financial administrators, and diplomatic agents who possessed technical expertise and educational backgrounds that enabled them to perform complex governmental functions while remaining politically dependent on their royal or ducal patrons. The military functions performed by ministeriales included both traditional knightly service in heavy cavalry units and specialized roles that required technical knowledge and administrative skills. Ministeriales commanded castle garrisons, organized siege operations, coordinated logistical support for military campaigns, and conducted diplomatic negotiations with enemy forces during military operations. These diverse military responsibilities required educational preparation and practical experience that distinguished ministeriales from other military personnel while reinforcing their dependence on royal favour for career advancement. The judicial authority exercised by ministeriales created new mechanisms for implementing royal legal authority throughout the German kingdom while accommodating local legal traditions and customary practices. Ministerialis judges possessed authority to hear cases involving different social groups and legal systems while maintaining ultimate responsibility to royal or ducal authorities who could review their decisions and modify their jurisdictions. This system provided flexibility in legal administration while ensuring that imperial legal authority could be implemented effectively throughout diverse territorial jurisdictions. The investiture controversy that emerged during the late 11th century represented the most significant challenge to imperial authority since the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire and demonstrated the tensions between Germanic political traditions and the centralizing tendencies that characterized medieval European political development. The conflict between Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII involved fundamental questions about the relationship between secular and ecclesiastical authority that had profound implications for the development of Germanic political institutions. The origins of the investiture controversy lay in the reform movement within the Catholic Church that sought to eliminate secular influence over ecclesiastical appointments and establish papal supremacy over all Christian authorities. Pope Gregory VII's prohibition of lay investiture challenged the traditional Germanic practice of royal appointment of bishops and abbots who controlled substantial territories and resources within the German kingdom. This papal policy threatened to undermine one of the primary mechanisms through which German kings maintained political control over their territories. Henry IV's resistance to papal demands reflected both his understanding of the practical requirements for maintaining royal authority within the German political system and his commitment to preserving Germanic political traditions that emphasized royal prerogatives in governing all aspects of territorial administration. The German bishops and abbots whose appointments were challenged by papal policy controlled approximately 1/3 of all German territories and provided crucial military and financial support for royal authority throughout the kingdom. The confrontation between Henry IV and Gregory VII at Canossa in 1077 AD represented one of the most dramatic episodes in medieval European political history and demonstrated both the power of papal spiritual authority and the resilience of Germanic royal traditions. Henry's journey across the Alps in winter to seek papal forgiveness for his resistance to papal policies create a powerful symbolic demonstration of papal supremacy, while providing him with tactical advantages that enabled him to resume his resistance to papal demands once he had secured release from excommunication. The political circumstances that forced Henry to seek papal reconciliation reflected the complex relationship between royal authority and ducal autonomy that characterized the German political system. The German nobles who opposed Henry's policies regarding papal relations possessed sufficient military and political resources to threaten royal authority, while Henry's excommunication provided religious justification for noble resistance to royal policies. The Canossa submission provided Henry with breathing space necessary to rebuild political support while maintaining his fundamental position regarding royal prerogatives in ecclesiastical appointments. The long-term consequences of the investiture controversy included significant modifications in the relationship between royal authority and ecclesiastical institutions that reflected both papal demands and Germanic political realities. The Concordat of Worms in 1122 AD established compromise arrangements that preserved royal influence over ecclesiastical appointments while acknowledging papal authority over spiritual matters. These arrangements created complex procedures that required coordination between royal and papal authorities while maintaining the practical administrative functions that ecclesiastical officials performed within the German political system. The development of distinctly German legal traditions during the early Holy Roman Empire reflected the systematic integration of Germanic customary practices with Roman legal principles and canon law influences that created hybrid legal systems adapted to the diverse populations and complex political relationships that characterized imperial territories. The imperial legal codes that emerged during this period provided frameworks for resolving disputes between different legal systems while establishing imperial legal authority over matters that affected multiple territorial jurisdictions. The Sachsenspiegel, compiled during the early 13th century, represented the most systematic codification of Germanic legal traditions and demonstrated the sophisticated legal thinking that had developed within German territorial jurisdictions. This legal compilation preserved ancient Germanic legal practices regarding personal relationships, property rights, and procedural requirements, while incorporating innovations necessary for governing complex territorial and social relationships that had evolved during centuries of political development. The legal principles preserved in the Sachsenspiegel emphasized the personal character of Germanic law and the importance of customary practices in determining legal relationships and obligations. The legal system described in this compilation provided detailed procedures for resolving disputes through negotiation, arbitration, and formal legal proceedings, while maintaining the flexibility necessary for accommodating diverse social and cultural circumstances. These legal traditions influenced the development of territorial law codes throughout the German kingdom, while preserving distinctive Germanic approaches to legal administration and judicial authority. The legal principles that had evolved within the Holy Roman Empire during the 11th and 12th centuries provided the intellectual foundation for a new form of Germanic expansion that would transform the political and cultural landscape of the Baltic region through the systematic application of military conquest, religious conversion, and territorial colonization. The emergence of military religious orders as instruments of Christian expansion represented a fundamental innovation in medieval warfare that combined the spiritual authority of monastic institutions with the tactical capabilities of professional military organizations, creating hybrid institutions uniquely suited to the challenges of frontier warfare and territorial administration. The Teutonic Knights originated in 1190 AD as the Order of Brothers of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem, established initially to provide medical care and military protection for German pilgrims visiting the Holy Land during the height of the Crusading movement. The Order's founding charter, issued by Pope Clement III, granted the German Knights the same privileges and obligations that had been accorded to the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller, while specifically emphasizing their role in serving German-speaking crusaders who required medical attention and military escort services in the dangerous territories surrounding Jerusalem and other Christian strongholds in the Levant. The military organization that emerged within the Teutonic Order reflected sophisticated adaptations of Germanic warrior traditions to the tactical requirements of fighting in the diverse geographical and cultural environments that characterized crusading warfare. The Order's Knight Brothers underwent extensive military training that emphasized both individual combat skills and coordinated tactical maneuvers designed for fighting against Muslim cavalry forces, siege operations against fortified positions, and defensive warfare in hostile territory. Their equipment included the finest armour and weapons available in medieval Europe, with each knight brother maintaining multiple war horses, specialised siege equipment, and the logistical support necessary for extended military campaigns. The transformation of the Teutonic Order from a Levantine medical and military organisation into a Baltic colonising force began during the early 13th century as the political situation in the Holy Land deteriorated and opportunities for territorial expansion in northeastern Europe became increasingly apparent to German ecclesiastical and secular authorities. The Order's Grand Master Hermann von Salza possessed exceptional diplomatic and military skills that enabled him to negotiate the complex political relationships necessary for redirecting the Order's activities from the Mediterranean to the Baltic region, while maintaining papal support and imperial authorization for their expanded mission. The papal authorization for Teutonic expansion into the Baltic region reflected broader ecclesiastical policies that sought to extend Christian influence over pagan peoples while creating buffer zones that could protect established Christian territories from potential threats. Pope Honorius III's Bull of 1217 granted the Teutonic Order extensive privileges for conducting missionary activities and establishing territorial control over pagan lands, including the right to retain conquered territories as sovereign possessions and the authority to establish ecclesiastical institutions throughout their domains. The imperial support that Frederick II provided for Teutonic expansion reflected his understanding of the strategic advantages that could result from establishing German political and cultural influence in the Baltic region. The Golden Bull of Rimini in 1226 granted the Teutonic Order sovereign authority over any territories they could conquer from pagan peoples, while providing imperial legal protection for their activities and formal recognition of their right to establish autonomous political institutions within the broader framework of the Holy Roman Empire. The initial target of Teutonic expansion was the region known as Prussia, inhabited by Baltic peoples who had maintained their traditional religious practices and political independence despite centuries of contact with Christian neighbours. The Old Prussians, as medieval sources termed these peoples, controlled territories extending from the Vistula River in the west to the Neman River in the east, encompassing diverse landscapes that included dense forests, extensive marshlands, fertile agricultural plains, and strategic river valleys that provided access to the Baltic Sea and its commercial opportunities. The political organisation of the Old Prussian peoples reflected sophisticated tribal confederations that had evolved over centuries to coordinate military defence, territorial administration, and religious observances among numerous smaller tribal groups. The major Prussian tribes included the Pomesanians, who controlled territories along the lower Vistula River, the Podgesanians, who inhabited the central regions between the Vistula and Pregel rivers, the Warmians, who occupied the fertile agricultural lands around the Pregel River, the Natangians, who controlled the coastal regions along the Baltic Sea, and the Sudovians, who inhabited the southeastern territories that bordered Lithuanian and Polish lands. Each Prussian tribe maintained distinctive cultural practices and political institutions while participating in broader confederations that could mobilize substantial military resources for defensive warfare against external threats. The Prussian political system emphasized the authority of noble families who controlled fortified settlements and maintained professional warrior bands that could coordinate military operations across tribal boundaries. These noble warriors, known as nobles in medieval sources, possessed extensive training in cavalry and infantry tactics, sophisticated weapons and armour, and the logistical capabilities necessary for conducting extended military campaigns. Prussian military organisation reflected their geographical position between Germanic, Slavic, and other Baltic peoples, requiring tactical flexibility and strategic sophistication that could address diverse military challenges. Prussian cavalry forces employed light horses bred for endurance and mobility in the difficult terrain that characterized their homeland, while their infantry units utilized specialized weapons, including long spears, battle axes, and composite bows that could engage enemy forces effectively in both open-field combat and siege operations. The Prussian practice of constructing elaborate fortified settlements provided defensive capabilities that could withstand extended siege operations while serving as bases for offensive military campaigns. The religious practices that unified Prussian tribal identity centered on the worship of natural forces and ancestral spirits through elaborate ceremonial observances conducted at sacred sites throughout their territories. The Prussian pantheon included deities associated with warfare, fertility, death, and natural phenomena, with particular emphasis on Perkunas, the thunder god, who provided protection for warriors and agricultural communities. Sacred groves, springs, and stone circles served as focal points for religious activities that reinforced tribal identity while providing spiritual sanction for political and military decisions. Prussian religious specialists, including priests and priestesses who maintained sacred knowledge and conducted ritual observances, played crucial roles in preserving cultural traditions and legitimizing political authority within tribal communities. These religious authorities possessed extensive knowledge of traditional practices, genealogical relationships, and customary law that made them essential figures in maintaining social cohesion and resolving disputes between different tribal groups. The religious significance of certain geographical features, including sacred forests and burial grounds, created strong emotional attachments to specific territories that motivated fierce resistance to external conquest attempts. The Teutonic conquest of Prussia began in 1230, with coordinated military campaigns that targeted strategic river crossings and fortified settlements while employing systematic tactics designed to disrupt Prussian military coordination and political unity. The initial Teutonic forces included approximately 700 knight brothers, supported by larger numbers of sergeants, crossbowmen, and support personnel, along with substantial contingents of German crusaders, who had taken vows to participate in the Baltic campaigns in exchange for spiritual benefits and opportunities for territorial acquisition. The military tactics that the Teutonic Order employed during their Prussian campaigns reflected sophisticated understanding of both the geographical challenges presented by Baltic terrain and the military capabilities of their Prussian opponents. Rather than attempting rapid conquest through decisive battles that might favour Prussian defensive advantages, the Teutonic forces implemented systematic territorial occupation that involved the construction of fortified positions at strategic locations, the establishment of supply lines connecting these positions with German base territories, and the gradual expansion of controlled areas through coordinated military pressure and diplomatic negotiations with Prussian tribal leaders. The construction of Teutonic castles throughout conquered Prussian territories represented one of the most significant military engineering projects of the medieval period and demonstrated the Order's commitment to permanent territorial occupation rather than temporary military campaigns. These fortifications employed sophisticated architectural designs that combined German castle-building traditions with innovations adapted to local geographical conditions and tactical requirements. The castles featured massive stone walls, elaborate gate systems, residential quarters for knight brothers and support personnel, and defensive arrangements that could withstand extended siege operations while providing bases for offensive military operations. The castle at Marienburg, constructed beginning in 1274, represented the pinnacle of Teutonic military architecture and served as the Order's primary administrative centre for their Baltic territories. The fortress complex covered over 20 hectares and included separate defensive circuits for the High Castle, Middle Castle, and Outer Bailey, with each section designed to function independently during siege operations, while maintaining internal communication and logistical coordination. The High Castle contained the Order's treasury, archives, and ceremonial chambers, while the Middle Castle provided residential quarters and administrative facilities for the extensive bureaucracy that governed Teutonic territories. The systematic nature of Teutonic territorial occupation required administrative innovations that could coordinate military operations, territorial governance, and economic development across vast geographical areas while maintaining the religious and military character that defined the Order's institutional identity. The Teutonic administration developed specialized departments responsible for military affairs, territorial governance, economic management, and religious activities, with each department headed by experienced knight brothers who possessed both military credentials and administrative expertise. The military administration of Teutonic territories emphasized the maintenance of professional military forces that could respond rapidly to Prussian resistance activities while providing security for German settlers and commercial activities. Each major Teutonic castle maintained garrison forces that included knight brothers, sergeants, crossbowmen, and support personnel, with standardized equipment and training that ensured tactical coordination during military operations. The Order's military forces also included substantial numbers of mercenary troops recruited from throughout the Holy Roman Empire, providing additional manpower and specialized capabilities that complemented the Knight Brothers' tactical strengths. The territorial governance that the Teutonic Order established in conquered Prussian lands combined German legal traditions with practical adaptations necessary for governing diverse populations that included German settlers, converted Prussians, and various other ethnic groups who'd migrated to the region. The Order developed legal codes that provided frameworks for resolving disputes, regulating commercial activities, and maintaining public order while accommodating different cultural traditions and social relationships. These legal innovations created hybrid systems that preserved essential elements of German law while adapting to local conditions and population characteristics. The economic development policies that the Teutonic Order implemented throughout their Baltic territories reflected sophisticated understanding of the relationship between territorial security, population growth, and commercial prosperity. The Order actively recruited German settlers through the offer of favourable land grants, legal privileges, and protection from military threats, while establishing urban centres that could serve as focal points for commercial activities and administrative functions. These settlement policies created substantial German populations throughout formerly Prussian territories, while providing the economic foundation necessary for maintaining the Order's military and administrative capabilities. The agricultural development that accompanied German settlement in Prussia involved the introduction of advanced farming techniques, new crop varieties, and improved livestock breeds that significantly increased agricultural productivity while supporting larger populations than had been possible under traditional Prussian agricultural systems. German settlers brought knowledge of three-field crop rotation, heavy ploughs designed for working clay soils, and water-powered mills that could process grain more efficiently than traditional hand-grinding methods. These agricultural innovations created surplus production that could support urban populations and provide resources for continued military operations. The urban development that characterized Teutonic territorial administration involved the systematic establishment of market towns and commercial centres that could coordinate economic activities while providing defensive capabilities during military emergencies. The Order granted municipal charters to numerous settlements throughout their territories, providing legal frameworks that encouraged commercial development while maintaining political control over urban populations. These urban centres became focal points for German cultural influence, while serving as administrative headquarters for territorial governance. The commercial policies that the Teutonic Order developed for their Baltic territories emphasized the exploitation of natural resources and the development of trade relationships that could provide revenues necessary for maintaining their military and administrative operations. The order controlled substantial timber resources that provided materials for construction and shipbuilding, while amber deposits along the Baltic coast generated luxury goods that commanded high prices in European markets. The development of these commercial activities required substantial investments in transportation infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and harbour facilities that could support expanded trade volumes. The resistance that Prussian peoples mounted against Teutonic conquest demonstrated both their military capabilities and their determination to preserve political independence and cultural identity, despite the overwhelming advantages that the order possessed in terms of equipment, training, and logistical support. The Great Prussian Uprising that began in 1260 represented the most significant challenge to Teutonic authority and demonstrated the persistence of Prussian political organisation and military effectiveness despite decades of territorial occupation and cultural pressure. The military coordination that characterised Prussian resistance activities during the uprising revealed sophisticated strategic planning and tactical innovation that challenged Teutonic assumptions about the military capabilities of their opponents. Prussian forces employed guerrilla warfare tactics that exploited their superior knowledge of local terrain, while avoiding direct confrontations that might favour Teutonic tactical advantages. These tactics included coordinated attacks against isolated Teutonic positions, the disruption of supply lines connecting Teutonic castles with German-based territories, and the systematic destruction of agricultural and commercial infrastructure that supported the order's territorial administration. The political dimensions of Prussian resistance involved efforts to coordinate activities among different tribal groups while seeking external support from Lithuanian, Polish, and other neighbouring peoples who viewed Teutonic expansion as threats to their own territorial security. The resistance leaders possessed diplomatic skills that enabled them to negotiate military alliances and coordinate strategic planning across tribal boundaries, while maintaining the political unity necessary for sustained military operations against superior enemy forces. The religious aspects of Prussian resistance emphasized the connection between political independence and the preservation of traditional religious practices that had been suppressed or eliminated in territories under Teutonic control. The resistance movement included efforts to restore traditional religious observances and rebuild sacred sites that had been destroyed during the conquest, while religious leaders provided spiritual sanction for continued military opposition to Christian authority. These religious dimensions of resistance created powerful emotional motivations that sustained Prussian military efforts despite the enormous costs and limited prospects for ultimate success. The suppression of the Great Prussian Uprising required substantial military reinforcements from throughout the Holy Roman Empire and demonstrated the extent of resources that the Teutonic Order was willing to commit to maintaining their Baltic territories. The military campaigns that finally defeated Prussian resistance involved systematic destruction of Prussian settlements, the execution or enslavement of captured resistance fighters, and the implementation of policies designed to eliminate the cultural foundations of Prussian identity. These harsh measures achieved their immediate military objectives while creating long-term resentments that would influence subsequent political developments in the region. The aftermath of the Prussian conquest involved systematic efforts to eliminate or assimilate the remaining Prussian population through policies that combined forced conversion to Christianity with cultural assimilation programs designed to replace Prussian languages, customs, and social institutions with German alternatives. The Teutonic Order established schools and churches throughout their territories, while prohibiting the use of Prussian languages and traditional religious practices. These policies achieved substantial success in eliminating Prussian cultural identity while creating hybrid populations that combined Germanic and Baltic cultural elements. The transformation of Germanic territories from collections of tribal duchies into a cohesive medieval German kingdom during the High Middle Ages coincided with an unprecedented flowering of literary, artistic and intellectual achievement that would establish distinctly German cultural traditions while drawing upon broader European influences. The development of Middle High German as a literary language during the 12th and 13th centuries provided the linguistic foundation for sophisticated poetic works that combined Germanic heroic traditions with courtly romance themes imported from French literary models, creating hybrid cultural expressions that reflected the complex political and social relationships characterizing medieval German society. The emergence of Middle High German literature represented a fundamental departure from the predominantly Latin literary culture that had characterized the early medieval period, as German vernacular poetry began to compete with ecclesiastical Latin texts for aristocratic patronage and popular audiences. The linguistic standardization that accompanied this literary development reflected broader political processes of territorial consolidation and cultural unification that were transforming the fragmented political landscape of the early Holy Roman Empire into more coherent regional identities, centered around major ducal courts and ecclesiastical centers. The Nibelungenlied, composed around 1200 AD by an anonymous poet working within the cultural sphere of the Danube Valley, represented the most significant achievement of early Middle High German epic poetry and demonstrated the sophisticated literary techniques that German poets had developed for adapting ancient Germanic heroic materials to contemporary courtly audiences. The epic's complex narrative structure combined traditional oral poetry techniques with written literary conventions borrowed from French and Latin sources, creating a hybrid artistic form that preserved Germanic cultural memory while addressing the social and political concerns of high medieval aristocratic society. The historical materials that provided the foundation for the Nibelungenlied derived from ancient Germanic tribal memories of the migration period, particularly the destruction of the Burgundian kingdom by Hunnic forces in 437 AD and the subsequent integration of these historical events into oral poetic traditions that had been transmitted across centuries through professional storytellers and court entertainers. The poet's adaptation of these traditional materials involved substantial modifications that reflected contemporary social values and political relationships, transforming ancient tribal warfare into courtly drama that explored themes of loyalty, honour and political obligation relevant to 12th century German aristocratic culture. The literary techniques employed in the Nibelungenlied demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both Germanic poetic traditions and contemporary European literary conventions, as the anonymous poet combined traditional alliterative verse patterns with rhymed stanzaic structures borrowed from Romance poetry. The epic's distinctive four-line stanzas, known as Nibelungenstrophen, featured complex rhyme schemes and rhythmic patterns that required exceptional technical skill while providing frameworks for extended narrative development that could sustain audience attention throughout lengthy recitation sessions. The social world depicted in the Nibelungenlied reflected contemporary German aristocratic culture rather than ancient Germanic tribal society, as the poet transformed traditional heroic materials into mirror images of high medieval court life complete with elaborate ceremonial protocols, sophisticated diplomatic relationships, and complex feudal obligations that characterized the political environment of the Holy Roman Empire during the late 12th century. The epic's portrayal of royal courts, knightly combat, and aristocratic marriage negotiations provided idealized representations of contemporary social practices while preserving the dramatic intensity and emotional power of ancient Germanic heroic poetry. The reception of the Nibelungenlied throughout German territories demonstrated the existence of sophisticated literary audiences capable of appreciating complex poetic works that required substantial cultural knowledge and literary sophistication for full comprehension. The survival of over 30 manuscript copies from the medieval period indicates widespread circulation among aristocratic households, monastic libraries, and urban patrician families who possessed the education and leisure necessary for engaging with demanding literary texts. The geographic distribution of these manuscripts reveals the extent to which German literary culture had achieved territorial integration that transcended the political fragmentation characteristic of the Holy Roman Empire. The development of courtly romance traditions in Middle High German literature reflected the cultural influence of French literary models, while demonstrating distinctive German adaptations that address specifically Germanic social concerns and cultural values. German poets working within the Romance tradition, including Hartmann von Auer, Wolfram von Eschenbach, and Gottfried von Strasbourg, created sophisticated narrative works that combined French literary techniques with Germanic cultural materials to produce hybrid artistic forms that appeal to German aristocratic audiences while participating in broader European literary developments. Hartmann von Auer's romances, including Eric and Yvain, represented systematic adaptations of Chrétien de Troyes' French originals that preserved the essential narrative structures and thematic concerns of the source materials, while incorporating specifically German social and cultural elements that reflected contemporary political relationships and aristocratic values within the Holy Roman Empire. Hartmann's modifications of French literary models included enhanced emphasis on feudal obligations, detailed attention to the ceremonial aspects of court life, and sophisticated exploration of the tensions between individual desires and social responsibilities that characterized German aristocratic culture. The linguistic innovations that Hartmann introduced into Middle High German poetry demonstrated exceptional technical skill and cultural sophistication, as he developed new vocabulary and syntactic structures capable of expressing complex psychological states and abstract philosophical concepts that had previously been accessible only through Latin literary traditions. His poetic language combined traditional Germanic alliterative techniques with Romance literary conventions to create distinctive stylistic effects that influenced subsequent generations of German poets, while establishing precedents for the development of German as a sophisticated literary medium. Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival represented the most ambitious achievement of Middle High German Romance literature, and demonstrated the extent to which German poets had mastered the technical and thematic challenges of extended narrative composition, while creating distinctly Germanic versions of international literary themes. Wolfram's treatment of the Grail legend combined French source materials with Germanic cultural elements and personal theological speculation to produce a complex spiritual allegory that addressed fundamental questions about the relationship between secular knightly achievement and Christian spiritual development. The narrative techniques that Wolfram employed in Parzival reflected sophisticated understanding of both oral storytelling traditions and written literary conventions, as he created complex interwoven plot structures that could sustain reader interest throughout an extended narrative, while providing multiple levels of meaning accessible to audiences with different degrees of cultural and theological sophistication. His innovative use of narrative perspective, character development, and symbolic imagery established new possibilities for German narrative poetry, while influencing the development of prose fiction in later centuries. The social criticism that permeates Wolfram's romance reflected contemporary concerns about the relationship between knightly ideals and practical political realities within the Holy Roman Empire, as the poet explored the tensions between individual spiritual development and the social obligations that defined aristocratic identity. His portrayal of court life, military campaigns, and feudal relationships provided sophisticated commentary on the political and social problems that characterized German society during the early 13th century, while maintaining the entertainment value necessary for aristocratic patronage. Gottfried von Strasbourg's Tristan represented the most psychologically sophisticated achievement of Middle High German Romance literature, and demonstrated the extent to which German poets had developed techniques for exploring complex emotional relationships and moral ambiguities that challenged conventional social values and religious teachings. Gottfried's treatment of the Tristan legend emphasized the tragic dimensions of passionate love while creating literary techniques for representing internal psychological states that influenced the development of European literature for centuries. The artistic sophistication that characterized Gottfried's poetry reflected extensive education in both vernacular and Latin literary traditions, as he combined traditional Germanic poetic techniques with classical rhetorical training and contemporary theological speculation to create a distinctive literary style that balanced emotional intensity with intellectual complexity. His innovative use of metaphor, symbolism, and allegory established new possibilities for German poetry, while demonstrating the cultural sophistication that German literary culture had achieved by the early 13th century. The architectural achievements that characterized the German lands during the High Middle Ages reflected both the economic prosperity that supported major construction projects and the cultural ambitions that motivated ecclesiastical and secular authorities to create monumental buildings that could compete with contemporary achievements in France, Italy, and other European regions. The development of Gothic architectural techniques in German territories involved creative adaptations of French innovations that addressed specifically German geographical, climatic, and cultural conditions, while contributing distinctive elements to the broader European Gothic tradition. The construction of Cologne Cathedral, begun in 1248 under the direction of Master Gerhard, represented the most ambitious architectural project undertaken in medieval Germany and demonstrated the technical capabilities and artistic sophistication that German builders had achieved through their participation in broader European architectural developments. The cathedral's design incorporated the most advanced Gothic engineering techniques available at the time, including flying buttresses, pointed arches, and ribbed vaulting systems that allowed for unprecedented height and structural complexity, while creating interior spaces that emphasized vertical movement and luminous effects. The planning process that preceded construction of Cologne Cathedral involved extensive consultation with French architectural experts and detailed study of contemporary Gothic achievements, particularly the cathedrals at Amiens and Beauvais, which provided technical models for the engineering challenges involved in creating structures of unprecedented scale and complexity. The German builders adapted these French innovations to local conditions, while contributing distinctive design elements that reflected specifically German aesthetic preferences and functional requirements. The construction techniques employed at Cologne demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Gothic structural principles and exceptional skill in coordinating the complex logistical requirements necessary for major architectural projects. The cathedral workshop employed hundreds of specialized craftsmen, including stone carvers, glaziers, carpenters, and metal workers whose coordinated efforts required elaborate administrative systems and technical expertise that rivaled the capabilities of contemporary secular and ecclesiastical bureaucracies. The construction process involved quarrying and transporting massive quantities of stone from distant locations, developing specialized lifting equipment and construction techniques, and maintaining quality control standards that ensured structural integrity throughout the extended building period. The sculptural programs that decorated Gothic cathedrals throughout German territories reflected sophisticated theological knowledge and artistic capabilities that demonstrated the cultural achievements of medieval German ecclesiastical centres. The portal sculptures at Strasbourg Cathedral, created during the late 12th and early 13th centuries, combined traditional Germanic artistic motifs with Gothic stylistic innovations to create distinctive regional variations that influenced subsequent architectural development throughout the Holy Roman Empire. The stained glass windows that provided luminous decoration for German Gothic churches represented collaborative achievements involving theologians, artists, and craftsmen whose coordinated efforts produced some of the most sophisticated examples of medieval decorative art. The windows at Chartres Cathedral, while technically French, included substantial German contributions through the participation of German glaziers and the patronage of German ecclesiastical authorities who commissioned specific windows and provided financial support for the broader construction project. The illuminated manuscripts produced in German monastic scriptoriums during the High Middle Ages demonstrated exceptional artistic sophistication and cultural achievement that rivaled contemporary productions in France, Italy, and other European centres of learning. The scriptorium at Reichenau Abbey, located on an island in Lake Constance, achieved international recognition for the quality and innovation of its manuscript illumination while contributing distinctive artistic elements to broader European manuscript traditions. The artistic techniques employed by Reichenau illuminators reflected sophisticated understanding of both traditional Germanic decorative motifs and contemporary European artistic developments, as they created distinctive hybrid styles that combined ancient Celtic and Germanic interlace patterns with Byzantine iconographic traditions and contemporary Gothic stylistic innovations. The Reichenau artists developed innovative approaches to narrative illustration that influenced manuscript production throughout the Holy Roman Empire, while contributing to broader European artistic developments. The Otto Codex, produced at Reichenau around 1000 AD, represented one of the most significant achievements of medieval German manuscript illumination and demonstrated the cultural sophistication that German monastic centres had achieved during the Ottonian Renaissance. The manuscript's complex iconographic program combined imperial political imagery with sophisticated theological symbolism to create visual representations of the relationship between secular and ecclesiastical authority that reflected contemporary political theories and religious teachings. The technical innovations that Reichenau artists contributed to manuscript illumination included new approaches to colour application, gold leaf decoration, and narrative composition that influenced the development of European book art for centuries. Their development of distinctive figure styles, architectural backgrounds, and decorative borders established regional artistic traditions that spread throughout German territories while contributing to broader European artistic developments. The rise of German cities during the High Middle Ages reflected fundamental economic and social transformations that created new forms of political organisation, cultural expression, and social identity that complemented and sometimes challenged traditional aristocratic and ecclesiastical authority structures. The urban development that characterised this period involved the systematic establishment of market centres, craft production facilities, and commercial networks that connected German territories with broader European and international trade systems, while creating distinctive urban cultures that would influence European development for centuries. The Rhineland cities that emerged as major commercial and political centres during the 12th and 13th centuries demonstrated the economic opportunities that resulted from strategic positioning along major transportation routes, and the political innovations that urban communities developed for governing complex commercial relationships and diverse populations. Cities including Cologne, Mainz, Worms, and Speyer evolved from episcopal centres and royal administrative headquarters into autonomous political entities that possessed substantial independence from traditional feudal authority structures, while maintaining complex relationships with ecclesiastical and secular overlords. The guild system that developed within German urban centres represented sophisticated institutional innovations that balance economic regulation with political participation, while creating new forms of social identity that transcended traditional aristocratic and peasant categories. German craft guilds established elaborate organisational structures that controlled production techniques, quality standards, pricing policies, and market access while providing social services, religious observances, and political representation for their members. The political functions that guilds performed within German urban communities included participation in city government, military defence, and judicial proceedings that created new forms of civic authority based on economic achievement and professional expertise, rather than aristocratic birth or ecclesiastical position. Guild representatives served on city councils, organised urban militias, and participated in diplomatic negotiations with external authorities while maintaining internal governance systems that regulated craft production and commercial activities. The social relationships that developed within guild structures created new forms of urban identity that combined professional achievement with civic responsibility, while providing frameworks for social mobility that allowed skilled craftsmen and successful merchants to achieve political influence and social recognition previously reserved for aristocratic and ecclesiastical elites. The guild system provided pathways for economic advancement that attracted rural populations to urban centres while creating distinctive urban cultures that differed significantly from traditional feudal social organisation. The commercial networks that connected German cities with broader European and international trade systems reflected the economic sophistication and entrepreneurial capabilities that German merchants had developed through participation in long-distance commerce. German trading companies established permanent commercial relationships with partners throughout Europe, while developing financial instruments and business practices that facilitated complex international transactions involving diverse currencies, legal systems, and cultural traditions. The Hanseatic League that emerged during the 13th century represented the most sophisticated commercial organisation developed by German merchants and demonstrated the extent to which urban commercial interests had achieved political influence that could challenge traditional feudal authority structures. The League's network of member cities, commercial privileges, and diplomatic relationships created a quasi-political entity that possessed substantial autonomy while facilitating trade relationships throughout Northern Europe and the Baltic region. The emergence of a distinct German identity during the High Middle Ages reflected complex cultural, political, and social processes that gradually differentiated German-speaking populations from broader Germanic and Frankish cultural traditions, while creating new forms of territorial and linguistic identity that would influence European political development for centuries. This identity formation involved the systematic development of German vernacular literature, the establishment of distinctive political institutions, and the creation of cultural symbols and traditions that emphasized the unique characteristics of German civilization. The linguistic developments that contributed to German identity formation included the standardization of Middle High German as a literary language and the gradual displacement of Latin as the primary medium for administrative, legal, and cultural communication within German territories. The development of German vernacular literature provided cultural expressions that addressed specifically German social concerns and political relationships, while creating shared cultural references that transcended regional political boundaries and tribal distinctions. The political dimensions of German identity formation involve the gradual recognition of the Holy Roman Empire as a distinctly German political entity rather than a universal Christian empire, as German territorial princes and urban communities developed institutions and practices that reflected specifically German legal traditions and political values. The development of German law codes, administrative practices, and diplomatic protocols created distinctive political cultures that differentiated German territories from French, Italian, and other European political systems. The cultural symbols that emerged as markers of German identity during this period included architectural styles, artistic traditions, literary themes, and religious practices that combined ancient Germanic cultural elements with contemporary European influences to create distinctive cultural expressions that reflected the unique historical development and geographical circumstances of German territories. These cultural markers provided foundations for territorial loyalty and political identity that would influence subsequent German political and cultural development throughout the medieval period and beyond. The cultural achievements that had distinguished German territories during the High Middle Ages provided the intellectual and institutional foundations for a period of unprecedented political fragmentation that would paradoxically strengthen rather than weaken the distinctive characteristics of Germanic political traditions. The death of Emperor Frederick II in 1250 AD marked the beginning of the Great Interregnum, a 23-year period during which the Holy Roman Empire lacked a universally recognized emperor, and German political authority devolved to regional princes who possessed the military capabilities and administrative sophistication necessary to govern substantial territories without imperial oversight. The circumstances that precipitated the Great Interregnum reflected fundamental tensions between imperial authority and territorial autonomy that had characterized German political development since the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire. Frederick II's prolonged absence from German territories during his Italian campaigns had forced regional princes to assume responsibility for military defense, judicial administration, and economic regulation that traditionally fell within imperial prerogatives. The administrative capabilities that territorial princes developed during this period of imperial neglect provided them with practical experience in autonomous governance that made them reluctant to surrender authority to subsequent imperial candidates who lacked Frederick's exceptional political and military capabilities. The electoral process that had traditionally selected German kings became the focal point for political competition among major territorial princes who possessed sufficient military resources and political influence to advance credible claims to imperial authority. The traditional electors, including the archbishops of Mainz, Cologne and Trier, along with the secular princes of Saxony, Brandenburg, the Palatinate and Bohemia, found themselves in positions where they could extract substantial concessions from imperial candidates in exchange for electoral support. This dynamic transformed the German kingship from an office that commanded territorial obedience into a position that required continuous negotiation with powerful regional authorities who possessed alternative sources of political legitimacy. The competing claims to imperial authority during the interregnum period demonstrated the extent to which German political identity had evolved beyond simple tribal loyalties or dynastic allegiances to encompass complex relationships between territorial sovereignty, legal authority, and cultural identity. Richard of Cornwall, elected by a faction of German princes in 1257, possessed substantial financial resources derived from English royal connections and could offer immediate material benefits to supporters, but lacked the territorial base within Germany necessary for effective imperial administration. Alfonso X of Castile, elected by an opposing faction in the same year, could claim superior genealogical credentials through his descent from the Hohenstaufen dynasty, but possessed even less practical capability for governing German territories than his English rival. The practical consequences of divided imperial authority included the emergence of autonomous territorial administrations that developed sophisticated governmental institutions capable of performing all essential state functions without reference to imperial oversight. The Duchy of Austria under the Babenberg dynasty established elaborate legal codes, maintained professional military forces, and conducted independent diplomatic relationships with neighbouring powers that demonstrated the administrative sophistication that German territorial princes had achieved during the 13th century. The administrative records that survive from this period reveal complex bureaucratic systems that could coordinate activities across substantial geographical areas, while maintaining detailed documentation of legal proceedings, financial transactions, and military operations. The military innovations that territorial princes implemented during the interregnum period reflected both the practical requirements of defending their domains without imperial support and the technological developments that were transforming European warfare during the 13th century. The adoption of crossbow technology by German territorial armies provided infantry forces with capabilities that could challenge traditional heavy cavalry dominance while requiring less extensive training than traditional archery techniques. The construction of stone castles according to the most advanced military engineering principles created defensive installations that could withstand extended siege operations while serving as administrative centres for territorial governance. The economic development that characterised German territories during the interregnum period reflected the commercial opportunities that resulted from reduced imperial taxation and regulation, as territorial princes competed to attract merchants, craftsmen and agricultural settlers through favourable legal privileges and reduced financial obligations. The expansion of German urban centres during this period involved the systematic establishment of market towns that could serve as focal points for regional commerce, while providing territorial princes with reliable sources of tax revenue and military recruitment. The legal privileges that territorial princes granted to urban communities included rights of self-governance, exemption from feudal obligations, and protection from arbitrary taxation that created powerful incentives for commercial development and population growth. The cultural achievements that emerged from German territorial courts during the interregnum period demonstrated the extent to which regional political centres had become sophisticated patrons of literary, artistic and intellectual activity that rivaled the cultural accomplishments of the imperial court during its periods of greatest influence. The court of the Landgrave of Thuringia at the Wartburg became a centre for middle-high German poetry that attracted prominent literary figures including Wolfram von Eschenbach and Walter von der Vogelweide, while providing cultural models that influenced aristocratic behaviour throughout German territories. The resolution of the Great Interregnum through the election of Rudolf of Habsburg in 1273 established precedents for imperial authority that would fundamentally alter the relationship between central government and territorial autonomy within the Holy Roman Empire. Rudolf's election reflected the German prince's recognition that effective imperial leadership required candidates who possessed substantial territorial resources within Germany rather than external dynastic connections or theoretical legal claims. The Habsburg family's Austrian territories provided Rudolf with sufficient military and financial capabilities to maintain imperial dignity while lacking the overwhelming power that might threaten territorial princely autonomy. The administrative innovations that Rudolf implemented during his reign balanced imperial prerogatives with territorial rights in ways that preserved the essential characteristics of German political development while creating mechanisms for coordinated action during military emergencies and diplomatic crises. The establishment of imperial courts with jurisdiction over interterritorial disputes provided frameworks for resolving conflicts between territorial princes without resorting to military force, while maintaining the autonomy of territorial legal systems for matters involving their own subjects. These institutional arrangements created hybrid governmental systems that combined imperial authority with territorial sovereignty in ways that reflected the complex political relationships characteristic of German constitutional development. The Golden Bull of 1356, promulgated by Emperor Charles IV, represented the most systematic codification of German electoral procedures and territorial rights that had evolved during the preceding century of political experimentation and constitutional development. This fundamental constitutional document established formal procedures for imperial elections while defining the privileges and obligations of the 7 electoral princes who possessed the authority to select German kings and Holy Roman emperors. The constitutional principles embodied in the Golden Bull reflected sophisticated understanding of the balance between central authority and regional autonomy that characterized effective governance within the German political system. The electoral procedures established by the Golden Bull created systematic mechanisms for imperial succession that reduced the potential for disputed elections while preserving the consensual character of German royal authority that distinguished it from the increasingly autocratic tendencies characteristic of other European monarchies. The requirement that electoral decisions be made by majority vote among the 7 electors, combined with the detailed provisions for electoral meetings and voting procedures, created predictable constitutional processes that could function effectively even during periods of political crisis or external military pressure. The territorial privileges that the Golden Bull granted to electoral princes reflected the extent to which German constitutional development had evolved toward federal arrangements that balanced imperial authority with territorial sovereignty. The electoral princes received formal recognition of their rights to maintain independent military forces, conduct autonomous judicial proceedings, and regulate commercial activities within their territories while acknowledging imperial supremacy in matters affecting the broader German political community. These constitutional arrangements created legal frameworks that could accommodate the complex political relationships characteristic of German territorial development while maintaining the institutional unity necessary for coordinated action during military emergencies. The jurisdictional arrangements established by the Golden Bull addressed fundamental questions about the relationship between imperial law and territorial legal systems that had created conflicts and uncertainties during previous centuries of constitutional development. The document established clear procedures for determining when disputes fell within imperial jurisdiction rather than territorial legal authority, while creating appellate mechanisms that allowed territorial subjects to seek imperial justice when local legal systems failed to provide adequate remedies. These procedural innovations created systematic approaches to legal administration that could accommodate diverse legal traditions while maintaining overall constitutional coherence. The military obligations that the Golden Bull imposed on electoral princes reflected the practical requirements of imperial defence, while respecting territorial autonomy and military traditions that had developed within different German regions. The document specified the military service that electors owed to imperial authority during defensive campaigns while preserving their rights to maintain independent military forces and conduct autonomous military operations that did not conflict with broader imperial interests. These military arrangements created frameworks for coordinated defence that could mobilise substantial German military resources while respecting the territorial military traditions that provided the foundation for regional political identity. The religious and cultural transformations that characterised German territories during the late medieval period created conditions that would fundamentally alter the relationship between political authority and spiritual life throughout Central Europe. The emergence of popular religious movements that emphasize personal spiritual experience over institutional ecclesiastical authority challenged traditional relationships between secular and religious power while creating new forms of cultural expression that reflected distinctly Germanic approaches to Christian spirituality and social organisation. The mystical traditions that flourished in German territories during the 14th and 15th centuries, particularly the writings of Meister Eckhart and Johannes Tauler, represented sophisticated theological developments that combined traditional Christian doctrine with philosophical speculation and personal spiritual experience in ways that influenced subsequent Protestant theological development. These mystical writers emphasized the possibility of direct personal relationship with divine authority that did not require ecclesiastical mediation, creating theological foundations for religious reforms that would challenge papal authority and institutional church structure during the following century. The vernacular religious literature that emerged from German mystical traditions provided frameworks for popular religious expression that bypassed Latin ecclesiastical culture while creating distinctly German approaches to Christian spirituality and moral instruction. The translation of biblical texts and theological treatises into Middle High German made sophisticated religious ideas accessible to lay audiences who lacked classical education while creating literary traditions that would influence subsequent Protestant biblical translation and religious instruction. The educational innovations that accompanied German religious and cultural development during the late medieval period included the establishment of universities and cathedral schools that could provide advanced instruction in theology, law, and natural philosophy, while serving the practical educational needs of territorial administration and commercial development. The University of Prague, founded in 1348 under imperial patronage, created institutional models for higher education that combined traditional clerical instruction with secular learning appropriate for territorial administrative service and commercial activity. The intellectual achievements of German university centres during this period reflected the cultural sophistication that German territories had achieved through their participation in broader European scholarly networks, while contributing distinctive elements to medieval intellectual development. German scholars made significant contributions to scholastic philosophy, legal theory, and natural philosophy that influenced European intellectual development, while creating academic traditions that would provide foundations for subsequent humanistic and scientific achievements. The Protestant Reformation that began with Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517 represented the culmination of religious and cultural developments that had been emerging within German territories for over a century, while creating revolutionary changes in the relationship between political authority and religious life that would reshape European civilization. Luther's theological innovations drew upon Germanic mystical traditions, humanistic scholarship, and popular religious sentiment to create systematic critiques of papal authority and ecclesiastical institutional structure that resonated throughout German territories and beyond. The political dimensions of Protestant reform reflected the complex relationship between imperial authority, territorial sovereignty, and religious identity that had characterized German constitutional development since the medieval period. The territorial princes who supported Protestant reform found in Lutheran theology powerful justifications for resistance to papal authority and imperial religious policies, while creating opportunities for enhanced territorial autonomy and control over ecclesiastical resources within their domains. The principle of cuius regio, eius religio, that emerged from the religious conflicts of the 16th century formalized territorial religious authority in ways that reflected broader patterns of German political development. The cultural impact of Protestant reform included the systematic development of German vernacular literature, educational institutions, and artistic traditions that emphasized Germanic cultural identity while challenging the Latin ecclesiastical culture that had dominated medieval European intellectual life. Lutheran emphasis on vernacular biblical translation and religious instruction created powerful incentives for German literary development while providing cultural foundations for territorial identity that transcended traditional political boundaries. The legal and constitutional innovations that emerged from Protestant territorial reforms reflected sophisticated adaptations of Germanic legal traditions to the practical requirements of governing religiously diverse populations while maintaining political unity and administrative effectiveness. Protestant territorial princes developed legal codes that could accommodate both Catholic and Protestant subjects, while creating institutional mechanisms for resolving religious disputes and maintaining public order during periods of confessional tension. The military consequences of religious reform included the development of territorial military systems that could defend Protestant territories against Catholic imperial authority, while maintaining the military capabilities necessary for territorial defence and internal order. The Schmalkaldic League that united Protestant territorial princes created military and political alliances that demonstrated the potential for coordinated resistance to imperial authority, while preserving the territorial autonomy that characterized German political development. The transformation of medieval Germanic political structures into early modern German states represented the culmination of constitutional, cultural, and religious developments that had been evolving for centuries while creating institutional foundations that would influence European political development through the modern period. The territorial principalities that emerged from this transformation possess sophisticated administrative capabilities, distinctive cultural identities, and legal systems that combined Germanic customary traditions with innovations necessary for governing complex early modern societies. The administrative systems that characterized early modern German territorial states reflected the institutional sophistication that had developed through centuries of autonomous governance while adapting to new challenges created by religious diversity, commercial expansion, and military innovation. The bureaucratic structures that territorial princes established could coordinate activities across substantial geographical areas while maintaining detailed records of legal proceedings, financial transactions, and administrative decisions that demonstrated exceptional organizational capabilities. The legal traditions that provided foundations for early modern German territorial governance preserved essential characteristics of Germanic customary law, while incorporating innovations necessary for governing diverse populations and complex economic relationships. The legal codes that emerged during this period balance personal relationships and customary obligations with systematic legal procedures and institutional authority in ways that maintained the distinctive character of Germanic legal development while adapting to early modern political and social requirements. The cultural achievements of early modern German territories, including literary, artistic, and intellectual developments, reflected the creative synthesis of Germanic cultural traditions with Renaissance humanism, Protestant theology, and early modern scientific and philosophical innovation. These cultural developments created distinctive German intellectual traditions that would influence European cultural development while preserving essential characteristics of Germanic cultural identity that had evolved over more than a millennium of political and social development. The lasting influence of Teutonic legal, cultural, and political traditions on European civilization encompasses fundamental contributions to constitutional government, religious liberty, cultural expression, and intellectual achievement that continue to shape modern European political and social institutions. The Germanic emphasis on consensual government, territorial autonomy, and individual rights provided essential foundations for modern democratic development, while preserving cultural traditions that have enriched European civilization through their distinctive approaches to law, literature, art, and social organization. The transformation of ancient Germanic tribal societies into sophisticated early modern territorial states represents one of the most significant political and cultural achievements in European history, demonstrating the remarkable adaptability and creative potential of Teutonic institutional and cultural traditions that have continued to influence European development through the present day.